Muito boa tarde a todos. Começa agora a quarta Conferência de Lisboa. Uma organização do Clube de Lisboa, de que tenho o prazer de ser o presidente. E sejam bem-vindos todos os participantes a esta quarta Conferência de Lisboa e a quantos se inscreveram nela e ainda se podem inscrever ao longo dos próximos tempos. Esta conferência decorrerá de hoje até sexta-feira, todos os dias, entre as 2h30, durante toda a parte da tarde. Como disse, as conferências são organizadas pelo Clube de Lisboa, que é uma instituição benévola, sem fins lucrativos, que no fundo é organizada por um conjunto de pessoas, cerca de uma centena de associados, que têm como essencial objetivo colocar Lisboa no centro dos grandes debates de natureza internacional, e em particular à volta das grandes questões globais. Este ano a conferência mudou de modelo, mudou de formato. Era para se realizar em maio, tradicionalmente organizada presencialmente, e tivemos, de facto, três sessões de 2 em 2 anos nesse modelo. Este ano, pelas razões que todos compreenderão, a conferência tem que ser feita por via telemática. Esta, digamos, é a má notícia. Eu diria que a boa notícia é a circunstância da conferência ser um pouco mais democratizada, a possibilidade de toda a gente em todo o lado, em Portugal e não só, poder ter acesso à conferência, quer em português, quer em inglês, com tradução e interpretação simultânea. Volto a dizer, no passado as conferências eram na Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian, esperamos que as condições permitam que no futuro possamos regressar a esse que é, digamos, um dos nossos parceiros institucionais fundamentais, a Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian. Vamos ter a honra de ter nesta conferência, logo a seguir esta minha intervenção, uma declaração de alguém que participou em várias edições da conferência e que há 2 anos nos deu a honra de estar presencialmente na sessão da Gulbenkian e que no passado foi mesmo orador convidado por nós, o professor Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, Presidente da República. É uma honra para nós tê-lo aqui presente, como é também uma honra para nós que a Presidência da República nos dê o seu alto patrocínio para esta mesma conferência. Também o engenheiro António Guterres, secretário-geral da ONU, vai estar desta forma nesta conferência, falando-nos um pouco daquilo que são os desafios globais que as Nações Unidas enfrentam e o modo como ele encara essas questões e, em particular, da contribuição que um debate como o nosso pode ter para isso. Vamos ter também o Ministro dos Negócios Estrangeiros, o professor Augusto Santos Silva. O Ministério dos Negócios Estrangeiros é um parceiro tradicional, através do Instituto Diplomático, desta conferência e tem um papel muito importante na sua organização. E vamos ter também a Comissária Europeia, Elisa Ferreira, que nos vai trazer, particularmente num painel específico, que já falarei um pouco adiante, um pouco daquilo que é a perspectiva da União Europeia perante a atual circunstância e, em particular, o modo como a União pode funcionar como um ator relevante no atual processo à escala global. Com ela estará também o Dr. Fernando Medina, Presidente da Câmara Municipal de Lisboa. A Câmara Municipal é, eu diria, um dos eixos, um dos pilares desta conferência. Paralelamente à Câmara, o Instituto Marquês de Valflor, uma organização de natureza não governamental, com um papel muito relevante na área da cooperação para o desenvolvimento, é, digamos, outra das âncoras com que nós contamos muito no trabalho do Clube de Lisboa e também das conferências de Lisboa. Mas não queria deixar de referir outros parceiros que nós temos, antes de passar, digamos, à substância da conferência, que é a Câmara de Comércio Portuguesa, o ISCTE, o Instituto Universitário de Lisboa, a SOFID, estrutura financeira para o desenvolvimento, a Fundação Portugal-África e a UCLA, a União das Cidades Capitais dos Países de Língua Portuguesa. Vários outros parceiros nos ajudam nesta conferência. Esta, como digo, é uma organização benévola e, portanto, precisamos de juntar a ajuda de várias entidades que nos ajudam a isso, e essas entidades estão referenciadas em toda a documentação desta conferência. Este ano tínhamos pensado centrar a conferência numa temática que era a aceleração das mudanças globais. Nós temos um pouco a consciência que as mudanças estão a ser aceleradas as grandes mudanças globais estão a ser aceleradas nos últimos anos, Mas decidimos, tendo em conta a nova circunstância criada pela pandemia, tentar colocar também a questão da pandemia ligada a esta aceleração. Em que medida, de facto, a pandemia é ou não um fator disruptor destas acelerações, ou aumentando-as, ou diminuindo-as, ou limitando-as. Separámos todo este debate em várias temáticas, eu diria, fundamentais para aquilo que é uma distribuição analítica. Em primeiro lugar, as pessoas. Vamos tentar, num primeiro painel, falar um pouco daquilo que são as realidades demográficas, quer a expansão demográfica em algumas áreas do mundo, quer a redução demográfica, com todas as consequências que isso pode ter para os países e para a capacidade dos próprios países se organizarem, e mais do que isso, para o próprio equilíbrio de natureza global, com todas as implicações que isso tem em matéria de migrações, etc. Depois falaremos de um tema que está sempre presente há vários anos no debate internacional, que é a questão do planeta. Em particular, sobre a trágica divergência que hoje se vive no mundo relativamente à questão climática e ao modo de encarar a questão climática. Aí procuraremos trabalhar um pouco o modo como as transições energéticas podem ou não também ter que ser aceleradas, tendo em atenção os impactos climáticos e as determinantes que esses impactos climáticos criam ao nível global. Depois também olhar aqui, e este é um aspecto curioso e novo, que é saber se a pandemia tem alguma coisa a ver com isto. Isto é, se estaremos a estragar o mundo e se, na realidade, o surgimento da pandemia redunda também de algumas das realidades já pré-existentes. Mas a pandemia tem, digamos, uma outra dimensão, também ligada às pessoas, mas ligada essencialmente aos valores, que é a questão da paz. Nós verificamos hoje que quer a pandemia, quer algumas derivas que já vinham a expressar-se à escala global, acabaram por suscitar, de forma variada e dependendo das agendas de preocupações nacionais diferenciadas, alguns medos, e esses medos estão a ser claramente pasto de uma apropriação, quer por agendas de natureza populista, quer por agendas de natureza autoritária, e umas não excluem as outras. Em que medida a pandemia e os medos também que a pandemia induziu e as dúvidas sobre a própria capacidade, quer dos países, quer das organizações internacionais, de gerirem esta nova realidade, pode ser contabilizada neste quadro. É um ponto da maior importância e isto leva-nos também à questão do papel do multilateralismo e os riscos que o multilateralismo hoje corre no plano mundial. Tendo em atenção, como é sabido, a menor atenção que o multilateralismo está a ter, por exemplo, por parte da grande potência do mundo ocidental, dos Estados Unidos, e os efeitos que isso tem, eu diria mesmo no próprio declínio das estruturas de natureza multilateral, que são vitais para a gestão de algumas destas mudanças, na questão climática, mas também na Organização Mundial de Saúde, etc. Acho que esta reflexão é importante. E por outro lado há aqui um aspecto novo, com que nós não contávamos neste quadro, que é o problema dos direitos, o problema da vigilância, o problema da suspensão dos estados de exceção. Tudo isto tem que ser ponderado e discutido de uma forma aberta e, se possível, moderada, porque é o nosso modo de olhar para estas coisas. Tudo isto prende-se também com a questão da prosperidade, do desenvolvimento. Será que estamos a caminhar para um maior gap, uma maior diferença entre os países mais desenvolvidos e menos desenvolvidos? Em que medida é que, por exemplo, a pandemia acabou por contribuir e acabará por contribuir para este fosso? Olhamos para isto também à luz daquilo que é a competição, e aliás o novo modelo de competição que está a começar a desenhar-se entre grandes potências, o modo como nisto se enquadra a questão das empresas transnacionais, com todos os elementos de fiscalidade, mas também ligados às questões de vigilância, às questões das tecnologias, ao modo como essas novas tecnologias trazem ao mesmo tempo oportunidades, mas também alguns riscos, nomeadamente alguns riscos para o modo de gerir a própria cidade democrática. E portanto, neste ponto, vamos olhar um pouco para aquilo que a União Europeia tem feito e está a fazer, para aquilo que é, pelo menos para alguns, pelo menos para mim, alguma surpresa positiva, isto é, a capacidade que a União Europeia teve, no momento de alguma dificuldade, tendo em atenção o Brexit, tendo em atenção a própria relação com o maior parceiro do outro lado do Atlântico, de conseguir encontrar soluções criativas, que não teve no passado face a situações também complexas, para enfrentar esta nova situação. Há aqui um espaço muito grande para debate. Nós vamos tentar que o debate desta conferência acabe com uma presença forte e muito interessante, e eu diria criativa, de jovens a discutir os seus próprios problemas e o modo como eles olham para estas questões. Não é colocar-lhes uma agenda, é provocá-los para uma agenda própria. E essa agenda própria tem a ver com as suas ansiedades, com a maneira como olham o futuro deles, porque é o futuro deles que está em causa, e é interessante perceber como é que eles olham esse futuro, como é que eles olham as oportunidades criadas pelas evoluções tecnológicas e os riscos que isso cria, como é que eles olham também, digamos, os próprios valores que tinham vindo a ser aculturados numa abordagem quase civilizacional no quadro global. Portanto, olhar um pouco para os jovens. Nós estamos a pensar que este modelo de associar os jovens aos trabalhos da Conferência de Lisboa e também aos trabalhos do Clube de Lisboa é um caminho de futuro. Volto a dizer, não procurando dar-lhes agendas para eles trabalharem, mas procurando perguntar-lhes quais são os problemas e as agendas que eles querem ver tratadas. E, portanto, eu espero que ao final desta conferência, ao final destes 3 dias de conferência, nós possamos sair bastante mais informados, tendo em atenção o conjunto de oradores, com umas dezenas de oradores, de 10 países diferentes, que vão estar presentes nos nossos debates. Se calhar saímos daqui com mais questões, com mais interrogações do que aquelas com que entramos. Mas provavelmente essa é a vocação deste tipo de exercícios, que é evitar a resignação, e evitar que fiquemos pura e simplesmente indiferentes perante as grandes questões mundiais, e tentar mostrar e tentar motivar e trazer as pessoas para debates interessantes que têm a ver com as coisas da vida e com a realidade para todos nós. Nós queremos que esta conferência seja uma conferência que nos permita olhar o tempo e o novo tempo com uma mentalidade aberta, recusando, e esse é um ponto importante, recusando intolerâncias e recusando radicalismos e visões sectárias. Esta conferência procura ser um espaço de moderação e um espaço de racionalidade. Eu espero que a possam aproveitar e desejo que tenham uns bons dias de debate e que esse debate possa ser útil às vossas próprias reflexões. Muito obrigado e sejam bem-vindos à 4ª Conferência de Lisboa.
Pena tenho eu de não estar convosco hoje. Essa é a primeira mágoa. A segunda mágoa é não poder, em geral, ter a participação que teria noutras circunstâncias, por força do cargo, que tem um peso institucional que é independente do estilo de cada Presidente da República. O estilo muda, mas a responsabilidade institucional é exatamente a mesma. E por isso recordo com saudade os tempos em que organizava, participava, podia intervir em iniciativas como aquela que, uma vez mais, é o símbolo, é o sinal da razão de ser do Clube de Lisboa. Saúdo o Sr. Embaixador Francisco Seixas da Costa pela liderança deste clube, recordando uma amizade já antiga. Saúdo também o Dr. Alberto Laplano Guimarães e a Sra. Professora Marina Costa Lobo, que o ajudam nesta tarefa cívica. E, sobretudo, agradeço. Agradeço por existir o Clube de Lisboa. Faz falta este tipo de dinamismo, expressão da sociedade civil na comunidade nacional que todos integramos. Saúdo e agradeço pelo facto de, ano após ano, escolher os temas da atualidade, os mais prementes, à escala internacional e à escala interna. não falta um: multilateralismo, multipolarismo, situação económica internacional, situação geopolítica internacional, desafios da pandemia, do pós-pandemia, medo, receio, de alguma maneira incerteza, imprevisibilidade, mas ao mesmo tempo também avanços no digital, avanços científicos e tecnológicos, desafios colocados à organização do trabalho e às relações na vida social, situação dos sistemas políticos, desafio muito específico levantado pelos chamados populismos e outros movimentos inorgânicos e antissistémicos dos dias de hoje. Tudo cabe nas vossas preocupações e nos trabalhos de hoje e de amanhã. Mas queria, em particular, agradecer-vos pelo facto de serem um exemplo daquilo que tem faltado, não direi em Portugal, apesar de tudo, mas tem faltado em muitas sociedades europeias e por esse mundo fora, que é a moderação. Faz parte da democracia o pluralismo, faz parte da democracia a diferença, faz parte da democracia o conflito, a controvérsia, a discussão, a polémica. Trata-se de dimensões que enriquecem a democracia. Simplesmente, fruto da crise dos sistemas políticos, económicos e sociais, da incapacidade dos sistemas partidários clássicos, da incapacidade das instituições, as mais variadas nacionais e internacionais, e, sobretudo, da incapacidade para resolver problemas básicos dos cidadãos, económicos, sociais, culturais, políticos, abriu-se um vazio. Este vazio não tem parado de se alargar. E porque a política, como a economia, como a sociedade tem horror ao vazio, alguém preenche esse vazio. E muitas vezes tem sido preenchido em termos de estilo, mas sobretudo de substância, de conteúdo, através de propostas antissistémicas que são legítimas, mas que muitas vezes socorrem daquilo que é mais discutível, como seja o sobrepor a forma à substância, o sobrepor a fulanização ao tratamento do conteúdo, o entrar pelo domínio daquilo que seria a radicalização, o extremar de posições, o oposto da moderação dos sistemas políticos, económicos e sociais. É legítimo. A democracia comporta essa realidade. E é um erro querer calá-la. É um erro querer, à base do rótulo, ignorar as razões que fundam o avanço dessas atitudes e movimentos. Mas faz falta a moderação. Faz falta a procura de consensos daquilo que é essencial. É muito importante haver alternativas. Quando não há alternativas, os sistemas entram em crise e depois em bloqueamento. Mas faz falta o consenso naquilo que seja verdadeiramente crucial para a estabilidade de projetos de médio e longo prazo. Eu queria agradecer-vos o facto do Clube de Lisboa, não omitindo nem escamoteando a divergência, ser um exemplo de moderação. Faz falta a moderação nas democracias contemporâneas, nas democracias mediáticas, nas democracias inorgânicas. Ela completa o radicalismo em curso. Ela atenua o extremar de posições. Ela viabiliza o diálogo sereno, substantivo, não fulanizado, mas substancial. Por todas estas razões, vos agradeço o vosso papel e desejo as maiores felicidades para o futuro. As felicidades do Clube de Lisboa significarão, de algum modo, a felicidade da democracia portuguesa.
Boa tarde a todos. Começo por lembrar que existe tradução simultânea na barra inferior da plataforma Zoom. Simultaneous translation is provided just by clicking in the lower bar of the Zoom platform. Em nome do Clube de Lisboa, agradeço a vossa presença neste primeiro painel dedicado ao tema Pessoas, abrindo a discussão sobre as consequências do declínio e da expansão da população nas diferentes geografias, através da lente alargada do desenvolvimento. Lembro que a 4ª Conferência de Lisboa versa a aceleração das mudanças globais e os impactos da pandemia. Eu sou a Cristina Pérez e tenho o gosto de moderar os 2 primeiros oradores desta tarde, que passo desde já a apresentar. John Ibbitson, jornalista do The Globe and Mail de Ottawa, Canadá, que contraria a generalidade das previsões demográficas no seu livro The Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline. Aldion Sal, doutorado em Sociologia e com uma extensa obra em desenvolvimento, é fundador e diretor executivo do think tank pan-africano African Futures Institute, com sede em Pretória, na África do Sul. No final das comunicações haverá um período para perguntas e respostas, para os quais agradeço que usem a secção Q&A do Zoom ou a secção de comentários do YouTube. Começo por passar a palavra a John Ibbitson.
Hello. So first of all, I will be offering you a brief discussion, a presentation of the topics discussed in Empty Planet. It is an honor and a privilege to be asked to speak at this conference today, and I'm going to keep these remarks as brief as possible, although it is a large topic, I understand, because I'm hoping that in the discussion and debate that follows, we will have the
Mais baixo, Guida, mais baixo.
I'm sorry? I'll continue then. 6 years ago, Daryl Bricker, who is the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, a global polling firm, and I decided that we would examine a group of demographers who have been questioning one of the most commonly held assumptions of our time. That assumption is that the Earth's human population is exploding, that the population boom is one of the great challenges of our century and affecting the environment, our food supply, global security, and that addressing population growth is one of the most urgent tasks that face us. We were aware that there was a group of dissident demographers who were questioning the population projections of the United Nations Population Division. And we wanted to see to what extent there was validity in those objections. So Daryl's a pollster and I'm a journalist. We went out into the field. We went to 6 continents over 2 years, talking to demographers and statisticians and academics, but also talking mostly to ordinary people, to young people, especially to young women, asking them what their plans were, what they intended to do in the future in terms of the number of children they hoped to have. We talked to university students at Seoul National University. We talked to aid workers in favela, Sao Paulo. We talked to people in Nairobi, to slum dwellers in New Delhi, to millennials at a dinner party in Brussels. And we came to the conclusion that the dissident demographers are right. The UNPD is wrong in projecting that the population of the Earth will grow from over 7 billion today to over 11 billion at the end of the century. In fact, the Earth's population is going to stabilize and then start to decline, somewhere around 9 billion people, somewhere around the middle of the century. It will be the very first time in human history that the population of the Earth has deliberately gone into decline, and a decline that once started will not stop for the foreseeable future. And by the foreseeable future, I mean for the rest of the century. So why do we believe this? Why are we on the side of the dissident demographers who think that population decline, not population explosion, is going to be one of the great issues of our time? The single most important reason can be summarized in a single word: urbanization. This planet is urbanizing at an incredible rate. There are now more people living in cities than living in rural environments around the world, and that process is accelerating. As a population in a given community urbanizes, four things happen. The first is that a child ceases to become an economic asset and becomes an economic liability. In a rural environment, a child might actually be a source of income, another pair of hands to work in the field. In the city, the child simply becomes another mouth to feed. So there is an expense involved in having children in the city, and couples reasonably decide to limit that expense. A second and equally important thing happens when a child moves, when people move into the city. Women acquire access to information. They become educated. They have access to formal education systems that they might not have in rural environments. They have access to mass media, the internet. They have access to other women who educate each other in what is the best future that they should individually and collectively pursue. When women move into an urban environment, they begin to demand things. They become empowered. They demand that they have legal rights. They demand that they have a right to vote. They demand that they have access to jobs that traditionally were reserved for men. And they demand to have control over their own bodies. And as soon as women have control over their own bodies, everywhere in the world, without exception, there is not one exception, they choose to have fewer children. A third thing that happens is the power of religion declines. In a rural environment, religion is a powerful force, and traditional religions emphasize the subordination of women to men. You move to the city, the power of religion declines. We looked at the Philippines, where the Roman Catholic Church is in tremendous crisis because of declining church attendance. At the same time, the fertility rate of the Philippines is plummeting. The same thing is true of the power of the clan. In a rural environment, family is all important, and you are surrounded by your aunties who are urging you to get married and settle down and have children. But when you move to the city, the power of family declines, the power of clan declines, the power of co-workers and peers increases. And when was the last time one of your co-workers urged you to have a baby? So urbanization leads to an economic impetus, an educational impetus, the decline of religion, the decline of clan, all of which combines to produce a decline in fertility. In the developed societies, countries such as Canada, this process took about a century and a half, from 1800 until the middle and late parts of the last century, before fertility rates reached 2.1. 2.1 is the all-important number, the replacement rate. At 2.1 on average, children per woman, a society has a stable population. More than 2.1, that population grows. Lower than 2.1, that population begins to decline. And throughout the developed world, the fertility rate is below 2.1, often far below 2.1. I say this, by the way, with news that just arrived yesterday. When we published Empty Planet last year, Canada had an official fertility rate of 1.6, typical of a Western country. Last year, Statistics Canada reduced it to 1.5, and yesterday, new data came out to say it has fallen to 1.4. So this is happening in developed societies around the world. But the big news is, it is happening in developing societies around the world as well. This is where the United Nations is getting it wrong. It is failing to take into account the acceleration of urbanization in developing countries, the acceleration of the empowerment of women in developing countries, and the acceleration of the decline in fertility in developing countries. For example, the entire Western Hemisphere, which includes North America, South America, the Caribbean, is now at replacement rate of 2.1. India has reached replacement rate of 2.1. When we wrote the book, we had them just above 2.1, but the latest data says they are now at replacement rate. China is at 1.5 and probably falling. The Chinese stand to lose between a third and a half of their population over the course of this century. So that is why we think that the planet's population is not going to reach 11 million. It's only going to reach about 9 billion, perhaps even as little as 8 billion, and then it is going to start to go down. When it starts to go down, there will be huge consequences, some good, some bad. Environmentally, there's nothing but good news. It will be a big boost in the effort to control global warming, to have fewer people on the planet. It will ease the strain on the oceans and on the food supply. And as people move from rural environments to urban environments, subprime farmland goes back to bush, which increases biodiversity and acts as a carbon sink as well. So there's nothing but good news on the environmental front. On the economic front, there is nothing but bad news. It is very difficult to maintain economic growth with a declining population, because every year there are fewer people born who then become workers who pay the taxes that support older people, their pensions and their healthcare needs. There are fewer laborers able to fill the needs of the economy. And while it's possible that automation might fill those labor gaps, a robot does not buy a smart black dress for the office Christmas party. Our economies are built on consumption. If you have fewer people every year, especially fewer young people every year, because it is the young who consume the most, then you have a great problem trying to fire economic growth. Just look at countries like Japan, even arguably the European Union, where growth is low and populations are steadily beginning to decline. So the economic news is not good. Geopolitically, it could be very interesting. As I said, we think about China as a country that is set to dominate this century, but they're going to have huge problems trying to manage an economy that is beset by rapid population decline. India is in a very good place. Its population is going to be stable. It too will eventually decline, but it will have a large young population. The population of Africa is going to be very interesting to watch. Obviously, it is the last place on earth where population fertility rates are very high. But we spent time in Kenya, and we noticed all the pressures that were underway in Kenya to lower fertility rates. One of the things that we talked in the book about the fact that Kenya was mandating that girls and boys both receive education through the elementary and secondary levels. After the book came out, we learned that for the first time last year, actually, for the first time, as many girls as boys sat the grade 8 graduation exam in Kenya. Of course, the girls did better on average than the boys. So we believe that there's great reason to hope, too, that although fertility rates are still high in Africa, they're coming down, and they're going to come down more rapidly than the UN predicts because of the growing empowerment and rights of women in Africa. So nothing but good news on the environmental front, nothing but bad news on the economic front, and a mixed bag on the geopolitical front. The only thing I would add, and here I will leave this part of the presentation so we get into a response and discussion, is that we can't know what will happen far down the road. We can't know whether in 2 or 3 generations from now, people will be tired of only having one baby and will decide to go back to having larger families. We can't know the exact impact on the economy, on the environment, and on global security, on migrations as a result of steadily declining population. All we can say is that population is going to steadily decline around the world throughout the course of the century. It is not a good thing or a bad thing. It is, however, a very big thing, and it's time that we confront it.
Okay. Obrigada, John Ibbitson. Eu passo agora a palavra ao professor Leon Sal.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you all who are viewing this webinar, attending this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The title of our panel reads, start with the question, which reads 8 billion people, and so what? The title goes further and is expanded by asking 2 other questions. Where and why is population expanding or declining? And what might be the implication? And will the future demographic dividend compensate for problems caused by the increased population growth rate in many countries? We therefore have to deal with 3 questions. The 3 questions raised are important, but I'm afraid that with the time allocation of 15 minutes, it is too parsimonious to address them adequately. So I will simply share my perspective, and I will share my views on as to why they are important from an African perspective and what can be done to address them. First of all, whenever this figure of the projected world population, 8 billion people, is put forward, attention is turned to sub-Saharan Africa, as it will be the main source of the world population growth. It will not be Europe, for reasons that have been made explicit by John. It will not be America. It will not be Latin America. It will not even be Asia. So Africa will be the main source of growth. Why is it so? The reason for the projected growth are known. A high fertility rate. Still in Niger, you have 6 children per woman. Kenya, in spite of all the efforts, you still have between 4 and 5 children per woman. And the second thing is that you have a youth bulge. In 2000, close to 15% of Africans were under 24. By 2020, 60% of Africans were under 24. And by 2050, 35% of the youth population worldwide will be African. In other words, the demographic transition is still slow. And this is the reason, because demographic transition is slow. That's the main reason behind this massive population growth in Africa. Second, the question is, how will African handle this massive growth? No matter what you say, there will be growth. So how will it be handled? And here you have different viewpoints, which I guess it may be worth to just cite them very quickly. One, you still have the Malthusian views, which point to the risk of food insecurity, particularly as agricultural productivity remains low. It is also likely to lead to environmental degradation of the production, particularly if the production system remain as they are, mainly based on extensive system, and it could spell doom for the survival of African states if not properly handled. That's the Malthusian perspective. You still have the perspective of Esther Boserup, who believe that population increase provides an incentive for innovation and intensification of production system, particularly if food prices increase as they should once the urban bias is removed, the urban bias of economic policy is removed. Then you have the Marxist views, which still believe that, which hold that population growth is neither a curse nor an asset. It all depends on, because it is not an independent variable, issues of social class structures have to be factored in and so on. And you have a fourth position, which I call the Renaissance revivalist proponent, who argue that this projected population growth should be seen as a good news, particularly because the continent has been depleted of its workforce for long by centuries of slave trade across Sahara and Atlantic. My take is that these four contrasting and at times widely opposing views are just possible scenario, albeit sketchy one for that matter, as they neither depict what the situation will be otherwise than in broad strokes, nor elaborate on the trajectories that would lead to the projected situation. They are based on unsubstantiated assumptions and reflect ideological stances more than a thorough knowledge of the African situation with regard to demography. They are therefore not very helpful, in my views, for the formulation of evidence-based policies which are required. Now, if one were to adopt a systemic approach and develop scenarios, I think very quickly, three major scenarios can be formulated. One would be a trend-based scenario where there wouldn't be any significant development but where there wouldn't be a catastrophic situation as well. Africa has been surviving to a large extent with economic situation changing from year to year, depending on rainfall and so on and so forth, or prices of commodities on the international market. There is no significant development, but there is no major crisis either. So that would be a trend-based scenario. Another scenario possible is one where, due to combination of internal and external factors, you would have a collapse of African economies, society. Sahel, for instance, become what has been termed a Sahelistan, and Mali, which is the epicenter of the Sahelian crisis today, can be just another Somalia. A third scenario would be an adaptation one where population growth would be under check, and the continents could reap off the benefit of a demographic dividend, as demographer called it. Now, the question is, which one of these three scenarios will prevail? It must be said that it is difficult to answer the question in view of the diversity of the situation in Africa. You have very small countries like the Seychelles with less than 200,000 people, and you have countries like Nigeria with close to 200 million people. So, but one thing remains sure, in spite of the diversity, is that the future will not be what it used to be, as control of human capital will be more and more central in the competition for expansion in the globalized capitalist system. According to late Samir Amin, who was an Egyptian economist, population dynamics will be an important factor in geopolitical positioning of the nations, along with some variables. And John, you did make the point earlier. So the challenge for Africa will be how to translate the current and expected demographic bonus into not only a demographic dividend, but also a social and political dividend. In other words, how can we promote and implement a development paradigm which reconciles sustained economic growth with social justice and environmental sustainability at various levels, whether national, regional, or global? Is the Sustainable Development Goals framework an appropriate one to achieve this objective? I would argue that indeed it can be a helpful one, but it must be expanded so as to make greater room and in an explicit manner to the missing link between economic transformation, social justice, and environmental sustainability. And that missing link for me is peace and political stability. The case for bringing peace in the equation has been made forcefully by African Union in its long vision and its Agenda 2063, which call for a quote unquote peaceful Africa in peace with itself as well as with the other continent. The case has been made by the UN repeatedly, which has conceptualized peace as the cornerstone or ultimate goal of the UN effort since the system was born. That was particularly highlighted by Boutros Ghali in the 90s when he developed his agenda, the first one of which was the Agenda for Peace, which was released in 1992. Antonio Guterres, the compatriot of some of you, has also made peace the cornerstone of his effort as UN Secretary General. At this juncture, I would like to emphasize that population dynamics, as well as investment decisions, are driven by prospects and vision of the future, as well as by confidence in the future. Peace and political stability do contribute to strengthening that confidence, whereas physical, social, environmental, and political insecurity or disruption trigger a sense of vulnerability, which is counterproductive in the long run, as it only creates a raider mentality or a free rider behavior that leads to the tragedy of commons. Therefore, initial Sustainable Development Goals framework should be expanded to encompass what has been called the 5P of structural transformation, meaning the first P means people, men and women, all age group with no one left behind, as the motto goes. The second P is prosperity, sustained economic growth. The third P is peace as a result of democratization of societies through political and security arrangement. The fourth P is planet referring to environmental sustainability. And the fifth P is partnership as the preferred modality for creating win-win situation and getting rid of the too often zero-sum game logic which is prevailing. So those are my opening remarks. I will be happy to respond to any question you might have, and I thank you for your attention.
Agradeço muito a sua participação. Eu ia pegar aqui numa coisa que o John Ibbitson disse inicialmente, ou seja, as más notícias boa notícia para o planeta, má notícia para a economia e grandes perguntas para a geopolítica. Um dos princípios, ou uma das consequências imediatas do confinamento, desta paralisia que todos nós vivemos, foi precisamente provar que era possível e muito rapidamente diminuir a taxa de poluição, ou seja, provar coisas que se pudessem ser feitas a nível político, foi uma paragem muito brusca, mas que se pudessem ser tomadas medidas políticas que as tornassem permanentes ou que as introduzissem numa medida sensata, que era possível agir. Ou seja, o pressuposto da sua afirmação é que continuarmos na mesma, ou seja, é má notícia para a economia se a economia continuar exclusivamente baseada no desenvolvimento do consumo, ou não?
So if the question is whether growth depends on consumption and whether growth is essential to the well-being of our societies, there may be alternatives to consumption as a driver of growth. There may be alternatives to growth as a driver of well-being in society. The book is not ideological in that sense. We live, Daryl and I, in a prosperous, liberal, democratic, capitalist society. Are there better models for Canada, for developed nations to pursue? Are there better models for developing nations to pursue? That we will leave to others who have many books to write about such things. All we can tell you with some degree of certainty is, at the present, the only way in which societies are able to grow and sustain themselves economically is through consumption as the basis of growth. And the only way they can continue to grow is if they have a population that is available to them to consume. Under the existing model, it is true, there is no alternative that we can see to economic stagnation down the road. And if you look at Japan, which has been challenged by 3 decades now of stagnation, and which has one of the, I believe, the fastest declining population in the world, we see that as evidence. And again, we don't know whether this is the ideal system for fighting global warming, whether there would be different and better systems to fight global warming, whether again that is a topic for others to debate. We are simply, in our book, trying to point out that a great big assumption under which all of these debates have taken place, which is ongoing steady population growth, is a false assumption. You need to remove that assumption and replace it with a new one, which assumes that there will be population stability and then population decline sooner rather than later in the developed countries, but already present or arriving very quickly in developing countries. That by the middle of the century, our population globally will be starting to go down. If you can plug that new variable into all of those debates will change. The nature of those debates will change. But we leave it to others to decide what will happen as a consequence.
Há uma questão que eu gostaria de levantar para ambos os oradores, que é, nós ainda estamos, do ponto de vista global, a fazer um forcing considerável. Provavelmente a União Europeia vai à frente pela paridade, chegarmos à paridade, ou seja, promover a mulher em todas as suas frentes. Há sociedades mais vulneráveis onde isso é mais difícil. Esta notícia positiva de que o acesso das mulheres à educação e à contracepção e a dominarem as suas vidas e poderem empregá-las em outras coisas que a ter uma quantidade grande de filhos, pode contribuir, ou seja, pode fragilizar as políticas que neste momento promovem as mulheres. O que é que podem pensar sobre isso? Qual é a vossa opinião?
Well, that is the extent to which this is actually a good news story. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm listening. We're listening.
I misunderstood the intervention. Let me then, I'll very quickly just say that yes, this is the good news story. The population decline is happening around the world because of the wonderful advancement of the empowerment of women in societies, first in the developing world, but now rapidly, increasingly in the developing world. I think the most poignant moment in our book came when Daryl was in the largest slum in New Delhi, and he was talking with a group of women, young women, in that environment, and they talked about how they did not want to have their mothers' lives. They did not want to be dominated by men the way their mothers were dominated by men. They did not want to simply be birth factories the way their mothers had been expected to be birth factories. They wanted jobs, they wanted income, they wanted independence. But they recognized that they lived in a society that was still very patriarchal, and they didn't know whether they would be able to live the kind of lives they wanted. And Daryl was conducting the interview, and he noticed that throughout the course of the interview, the women kept looking down like this under their saris. He wondered what they were doing. And then he saw the flash of a backlit screen. These women all had smartphones. They were all connected to the internet. They had there in their hands the sum of human knowledge. And as we said in the book, we think we know how this debate will end. I would add with one other thing that we mentioned in the book. There was a report, I believe it was by the African Union, but I stand to be corrected, that said there is no problem in Africa to which the solution is not educate girls.
Uhum. Professor Sal, o que é que tem a dizer sobre este assunto? É tão variado o panorama da África?
Well, I think that two things. One is that when I hear there is no alternative to consumption in order to sustain growth and so on and so forth, I am reminded of the Reagan and Thatcher era. And we were calling it teen syndrome because Mrs. Thatcher used to say there is no alternative, and we call it Tina syndrome. We believe that from an African perspective, there should be an alternative because Africa is now living in a situation where we are consuming what we are not producing, and we are producing what we are not consuming. And that trend is not sustainable. Africa is producing raw material, exporting them, meaning that we are exporting jobs while we need jobs because of the use, and we are consuming what is produced somewhere else, and therefore we are increasing our dependence, whether it is on the food side or anywhere else. The ideas, thinking, we are importing, and we are neglecting our own capacity to produce goods in order to meet our basic needs. So what may be true for Canada is certainly not true for Africa. We need to find an alternative way of living, alternative way of meeting our basic needs, and we cannot base our development only on consumption without asking consumption of what and by whom. Because in Africa today, yes, you get big consumers, big spenders, but it is a small part of the population. And what they consume is not produced in Africa. Even the air they are breathing is imported because they use aircon. Okay, so the question is who consumes what and where does it come from? Now, on the second issue I'd like to comment, and I would agree with you, is that investing in girls' education is a way to the future. You cannot exclude half of the population, sometimes more than half of the population. It is not sustainable for economic reason, for social reason, for political reason, and even for ethical reason. And therefore, investing in girls' education, I believe that this is, yes, the right thing to do. And the African countries which are engaged in that way are definitely doing what needs to be done.
Não é o nosso tema necessariamente aqui diretamente, mas falou numa coisa muito interessante da urbanização, ou seja, o professor Sal, a propósito das capitais africanas e da sua vulnerabilidade, ou seja, são na sua maioria costeiras e grandes estruturas muito vulneráveis a alterações climáticas. Quando diz que a crise, esta crise pandémica foi uma oportunidade para repensar as oportunidades, aliás, as prioridades, repensar as prioridades, apesar de tudo está muito longe da possibilidade de fazer um reset, ou seja, essas estruturas existem, quanto muito pode-se investir noutras áreas da urbanização, ou seja, esta seria a minha primeira questão relativamente à urbanização.
I think we need to do two things. We need to walk on 2 feet. Africa, there is a legacy of dependence. Whatever we do, we need to be aware of that. The way our urban settings are organized, they were organized in order to simply be a transit point for exporting goods to Europe or to America or to the Arab world, wherever it was, since the days of the slave trade. Okay, our urban cities have been planned for that. And now you need to deal with that. That legacy has to be transformed. We cannot continue to have 80% of our GDP just produced by cities because they are linked to external world and have no relationship with their hinterland, particularly if the urban cities are on the coastal areas, which are very vulnerable to climate change and things like that. So we need to make sure that make those cities a little bit more productive than what they are today, because in our cities, informal sector is dominant sector, and the informal sector is a sector of low productivity. So we have to make sure that we increase the productivity in the urban setting, but we have to make sure as well that we do invest in our rural areas, because unlike what is happening in Europe, or what has happened in Europe, what has happened in Latin America, in Africa, you have a dual movement, increase of the urban population, but at the same time, you have an increased rural population, you know? So urbanization is not at the expense of the rural population. It is increasing. So we need to walk on 2 feet, better manage our cities so as to make them more productive and more linked to their hinterland, so that they become really the concern for self-sufficiency is taken on board. On the other hand, we need to invest in rural areas so as to retain the labor force which is there in the rural areas, rather than having them all flock into the city just to increase the rank of the informal sector, which is a sector of low productivity.
I would point out, however, that and again, this is not a question of advocating or opposing, but nonetheless, every place on earth is urbanizing. There is no society in which there is anything other than a migration from the rural to the urban, from East Timor to Kenya, to Latin America. It is universal. So the effort to slow the pace of urbanization will be a doomed effort, because there is no evidence anywhere in the world that has succeeded. And also, as we point out in the book, the challenge of rural environment is that it is an environment that is not conducive to the education of women. It is not an environment that is conducive to the empowerment of women. I don't know of any place on earth yet that has found a way to overcome the prejudices that dominate rural environments around the world. but those prejudices are real, and they affect, among other things, the number of children a woman has.
I think, I think that you're right when you say that migration, urbanization is a major trend and nobody has been able to stop it. Well, there have been two countries, but they are bad examples. One was China during the Cultural Revolution, and the other one was Cambodia during the Khmer regime. Those are the only two countries, two bad examples where urbanization has been stopped. So I agree with you that it is a trend and there is no way one can try to stop it. Okay. But what kind of urbanization is the question that we have to ask ourselves. As I was saying, the industrialization, the urbanization which is taking place in Africa is not taking place in the context of industrialization. Urbanization has taken place somewhere else in the world. It has gone along with industrialization. So labor force that was coming from the rural areas could find gainful employment in the industry. This is not the case in Africa. Urbanization has been taking place in the context of deindustrialization. And therefore, that explains why you have people flocking in the informal sector. And the informal sector, as I say, is a sector of low productivity. So this is not what you want people to be doing, going into areas where the productivity remains low, because it's a huge pressure on urban infrastructure and it does not increase the total productivity, the global productivity. So we need to qualify what type of urbanization we are talking about. Second, I'm not saying that we should stop urbanization. I'm saying we need to be aware of the fact that rural areas are still being populated in Africa. It is not like 9% of the people will be in urban areas by the end of the century. You will still have up to 40% of the people who will be living in the rural areas. So we cannot turn a blind eye and say we are just concentrating on what is going to happen in urban dwelling because that's where progress will come from. There is no reason why girls' education cannot take place in rural areas. Today, with the new technologies, we can perfectly reach out to girls in rural areas. And therefore, we should not give up and just believe that we should focus on the urban dwelling. So that's why I'm saying, let's walk on 2 feet rather than on one.
Eu gostaria de colocar agora uma questão pensando no mundo pós-Covid. O professor Sal disse que a crise é uma oportunidade de repensar as prioridades e que ela mostrou a importância da sociedade de um tipo de empregos que eram habitualmente invisíveis e desvalorizados. A minha pergunta para os dois, mais uma vez, é se existe uma possibilidade no mundo pós-Covid de o fator social ser tomado em consideração de uma maneira mais credível e mais forte e mais determinante para as políticas. Penso no mundo, posso pensar no Canadá, penso provavelmente mais neste aspecto nos países africanos.
Very briefly, we do not speculate, and I do not want to go into it speculating about, again, socioeconomic systems and how they may change in the future. I'm pretty confident, however, that COVID will not have any impact on those systems. It is an awful thing that we're going through, but it will end and we'll move on. It doesn't strike me as the kind of great tectonic shift that can produce fundamental change in society. The only aspect of the pandemic that relates to Empty Planet is one that could be referred to as fake news. In the 1960s, New York was struck by a power blackout. And the New York Times reported 9 months later that there was a surge of babies in New York as a result of the blackout. All those people who had nothing to do in the dark. that academic studies later debunked the story. It was false. There was no baby boom at all in New York. And in fact, the pandemic will not, as some are suggesting, lead to a baby boom in December and January, when we were all locked down. And again, had nothing to do. But the opposite is true. There is good data to suggest that economic recessions permanently reduce the fertility rate of a society. That is to say, young people decide not to have children because times are difficult. And so the fertility, they postpone having children, say, in their 20s. They do not then, when times get better in their 30s, make it up. They don't have 3 kids in their 30s to make up for the fact that they had none in their 20s. They simply don't have as many children as they had initially intended to do. So the pandemic will have, if anything long-term happens as a result of it, it will further suppress the fertility rates. By the way, and this is new data that has been emerging since the book, a data that is emerging here in Canada and in the United States. There is strong evidence to suggest that fertility rates are going to come down much faster than we predicted, because the millennial fertility rate in Canada and in the United States, and I assume in other developed countries as well, appears to be 1. We assumed when that data first arrived that this was because of the 08-09 recession, and that fertility rates would pick up after the recession. They haven't picked up. The millennial fertility rate in Canada and other developed countries is 1. The big question then, so 1 full baby short of what you need to sustain your population. The question then is the millennial population and whatever comes after it in developing countries, are their fertility rates falling as rapidly as they are in developed countries? I suspect, all things being equal, the answer will be yes.
It's very difficult for me to speculate about what will happen after this COVID and how it will affect, whether it will affect deeply the value system, whether it will affect the economic policies, and so on and so forth. But I think one thing that we should learn from this COVID situation is that we do have a serious crisis when it comes to knowledge. There is a serious knowledge gap. Up to now, we have not been able to figure out what happened really. And countries where we were expecting knowledge to be there have shown that they didn't have any answer to the crisis. Europe was a good example. They didn't know what to do. Some were confining, others were not confining. Up to now, they don't know. Doom if you do, doom if you don't do it. And Africa, which was expected to be an hecatomb, everybody was expecting millions of people dying. The Secretary General was on record saying that there would be millions of Africans who would be dying. Today, there are less Africans who have died from COVID than in Italy. You're talking about 35,000 people who died from COVID. That is the number of people who died in Italy, which means that there are a number of things which we do not know. Now they're trying to speculate on why is it that the death rate was so low in Africa. Has it to do with the weather? Has it to do with genetic? Whatever it is. So I think what it teaches me is that let's not rush to any conclusion. Let's accept that there are still a number of things we do not know. That being said, what COVID has shown, I guess, is the vulnerability of our system as it is. Vulnerability when it comes to food production, the dependence over imports when it comes to food production, which means that we could not confine, for instance, the population because we would have been enabled to simply provide them with basic food, because the basic food is imported from Thailand and there was no boat coming. There was rice is coming from Thailand. So the dependence on external world for food self-sufficiency is something which I guess is a vulnerability. We need to address it, to deal with it, because there will be other viruses, and we may be, the issue that has come up, which is a source of vulnerability, is the health situation. When a country cannot produce simple things like masks, obviously we have a problem. tomorrow there may be a vaccine, but at how much will it cost? Will it be affordable? Will it be accessible? How are we going to make sure that it is available for our population? So that dependence for health, which is the basic human needs and the human right, is something which we need to be addressing. So I guess what I'm saying is, let's not rush to quick conclusion, and let's accept that there are areas where we need to change the way we see things, and we need to get our priority right. And for me, human security is more important than state security. And therefore, investing in human security through health, through nutrition, through education, through women empowerment is of the essence.
Eu gostaria de perguntar ao John Ibbitson qual é a sua opinião relativamente a isto que o professor Sala acabou de dizer. Mas tenho que prevenir que eu vou ter de sair desta sessão porque eu perdi o acesso ao painel principal e, pela minha experiência, a única maneira é sair e voltar a entrar. Portanto, eu vou desaparecer um bocadinho e volto desde já. Peço desculpa, mas tem que ser assim. John, por favor.
Well, let me use the floor to raise a topic that I hadn't had a chance to talk about before. And that is, what do you do if your society's population is declining and you want to reverse that decline? Some people believe that there are policies that you could put in place to encourage women to have more children. We disagree. There's no evidence anywhere in the world that policies that are designed to encourage women to have children succeed. We do support, of course, policies that will allow women to have children while also being able to remain in the workplace, to not have to sacrifice career. But childcare policies are very welcome. But policies such as the ones in Hungary, where they're just trying to bribe women to have babies who wouldn't have babies otherwise, are, we think, first of all, insulting, and second of all, unlikely to succeed. There's no evidence to suggest anywhere that they have succeeded. The other thing I would then raise, while we wait for Christina to log back on, is the importance of immigration. There is really only one way to reverse fertility decline in a country, and that is to bring in immigrants into your society. This obviously is a challenge for some societies more than others. Canada is a society, apart from our Indigenous population, of immigrants. We bring in about 1% of our population every year. We were to have brought in 340,000 people this year. Not out of any sense of beneficence or humanitarian, it's pure selfish greed. We have long learned that bringing in immigrants, first of all, compensates for the declining fertility rate in our country, but second of all, energizes the economy, energizes the society, creates a more diverse, tolerant, and vibrant place, makes Canada a more interesting country. And in our book, we urge that countries that find themselves confronted with the problems of population decline have a solution, which is imitate Canada, to be selfish about it, to brag, bring in robust numbers of newcomers from around the world in order to both preserve your population and to grow your economy. But we became aware as we worked on the book and traveled around the world that for many societies, this just isn't on. China does not accept immigrants. Japan does not accept immigrants, not in any appreciable numbers. They may bring in temporary foreign workers to fill in labor gaps, but they would not welcome them as permanent citizens. And so if you do not have, for social reasons or societal reasons, an openness to immigration, then the blunt truth is there is no solution to the question of population decline. Your population will, like that of several dozen countries in the world right now today, get smaller every year, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. I have talked as long as I possibly could. Is somebody going to come and rescue me?
Continuo sem ter acesso às perguntas. Se alguém da administração me puder ajudar, é porque com o reabrir elas desapareceram. Eu gostaria de passar para as perguntas do público. Parece que não está fácil.
Hello, Christina. Hi to all. Hi, John. Hi, Alion. Just to help a little, Christina from the central panel and Regi. One of the questions that is being put here is how would, in your opinion, both of you, universal income policies encourage population increase or decline? And it will be the last question because we will have to stop after this.
All right.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, this is an active debate here in Canada. The Liberal government is moving towards a policy of a universal basic income. And there are proponents and opponents of it. I did a study of universal basic income with my colleague, David Parkinson of the Globe and Mail. We found that it is doable in Canada. I can't speak to other countries. It is doable in Canada to provide a basic income for every citizen, whether they're who is unemployed, at around the minimum wage that we currently pay. So about $25,000 a year in Canada. It could only be done, and of course this came out of the pandemic when we were forced to support vast numbers of Canadians who were rendered unemployed. It can be done, but in order to do it, you have to essentially scrap all other social programs. You have to scrap old age security. You have to scrap welfare. You have to scrap housing allotments. In essence, you have to eliminate the entire social safety net and pour it into a single universal basic income. And then you need a large tax hike. Not an overwhelmingly large tax hike. It would be doable. It could be done. But if your society, at least to the extent your society is similar to Canadian society, wants to move to universal basic income, then you can do it. But you have to scrap all of the rest of your social safety net, and you have to significantly raise your income taxes and your VAT.
Professor Sal?
Well, I guess, yes, I'm following debates on the universal basic income. Obviously, for countries which are indebted as ours, this is a non-starter. You cannot provide universal basic income when you cannot even pay those who are working, even at very low levels. But it is possible probably if we do look at the global economy. African countries are losing $88 billion every single year due to fiscal evasion and so on and so forth, to corruption and so on. 88 billion. Those are the figures that were released yesterday by UNCTAD. If we could recover some of those, plug the holes, and make sure that this money is not going into private pocket or in the coffers of some countries in the West, probably we could be in a better position to think about universal basic income, because that's more than what we owe in terms of debt repayment.
Resta-me agradecer, chegamos ao final do nosso tempo deste painel, agradecer ao professor Sal e John Ibbitson pelas abordagens interessantes e pela disponibilidade para conversar. Obrigada a todos por terem estado connosco e terminamos aqui.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Este sim. Não, não faz mal.
É com muito gosto que me dirijo à edição deste ano das Conferências de Lisboa, cujo programa, no momento em que nos confrontamos com a pandemia Covid-19, se concentra na análise de um amplo leque de questões prementes e interligadas. A pandemia constitui um enorme teste, incluindo para as Nações Unidas. Face a um vírus que nos afetou a todos e que não conhece fronteiras, a ONU mobilizou-se, nomeadamente através da Organização Mundial de Saúde, na assistência médica e sanitária, sobretudo aos países com menos recursos e com sistemas de saúde mais frágeis. Lançou também um plano global de resposta na área humanitária e produziu ainda uma análise profunda dos impactos e consequências da pandemia em diversos setores, empenhando-se a combater a desinformação através da campanha Verified. Enquanto secretário-geral da organização, apelei em março a um cessar-fogo global que permitisse focar os esforços no combate a um inimigo comum, o vírus. Reiterei este apelo na semana passada perante a Assembleia Geral da ONU. E tenho assinalado também a necessidade de recursos em larga escala para apoio aos países menos desenvolvidos e de uma vacina como um bem público global acessível a todos. A pandemia exacerbou desigualdades e fragilidades prévias que exigem um repensar de abordagens no processo de recuperação. Tenho-me referido à necessidade de um novo contrato social no seio de cada país, bem como de um novo acordo global entre Estados que promova uma globalização justa, uma mais equitativa distribuição do poder, riqueza e oportunidades e uma mais eficaz governance internacional. Importa também que os Estados, à medida que forem recuperando as respectivas economias, se empenhem na ação climática, acelerando a transição energética de modo a atingir a neutralidade carbónica em 2050. Enfim, é neste contexto difícil que a ONU comemora este ano o seu 75º aniversário. Estou convencido que, mais do que nunca, a cooperação e solidariedade internacionais são vitais para enfrentarmos os problemas com que nos deparamos e continuaremos a deparar nos anos vindouros. Só desse modo conseguiremos vencer a pandemia e realizar a ambição de um futuro de paz, dignidade e desenvolvimento sustentável num planeta saudável, em conformidade com a Agenda 2030 e os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Faço votos de êxito para a edição de 2020 das Conferências de Lisboa.
So, everyone on board. Viva, sou Agostinho Miranda. Hello, everyone. I'm Agostinho Miranda. Some housekeeping, algumas observações sobre os trabalhos deste painel. Esta conferência está a ter lugar na plataforma Zoom, com tradução simultânea, para a língua inglesa e portuguesa, conforme for o caso. Também está a ter lugar em live stream no YouTube. Now in English, this conference is taking place via the Zoom platform with simultaneous translation into Portuguese or English, as the case may be. It can also be followed live stream on YouTube. Em nome do Clube de Lisboa e do seu diretor executivo, o professor Fernando Jorge Cardoso, quero agradecer, em nome de todos os membros do painel, a participação destes 3 oradores, distintos oradores, e de todos os participantes que nos estão a seguir. O tema que nós vamos debater tem o título As Divergências sobre a Ação Climática, que energia para qual futuro? E para o fazer temos 3 especialistas de craveira mundial, Jennifer Lake, do conhecidíssimo, reputadíssimo World Resources Institute, WRI, a professora Karin Beckstrand, professora da Universidade de Estocolmo, e o nosso, permitam-me que diga desta maneira, Miguel Araújo, docente da Universidade de Évora. Eu, antes da intervenção de cada um deles, farei uma apresentação mais detalhada, como obviamente me compete. Sobre o formato deste painel, eu farei uma pequena introdução, esperemos que não mais de 5 minutos. Depois, cada um dos oradores terá entre 10 e 15 minutos para a respectiva intervenção e seguir-se-á um debate entre os membros do painel e com os participantes que nos estão a seguir. Poderão, para o efeito, enviar-nos as vossas questões, comentários, etc., através da função Q&A no Zoom e na secção de comentários do YouTube. A equipe de suporte ao nosso painel escolherá as questões e os comentários que lhes pareçam mais relevantes e, desde já, nós, obviamente, oferecemos as nossas desculpas se a triagem não for feita de forma mais equitativa para todos. E agora a minha curta introdução. O meu objetivo é ser um bocadinho mais objetivo do que o foi ontem o futuro presidente dos Estados Unidos. Provavelmente não será muito difícil e também não será um grande feito, posto que eu tenho a enorme vantagem de ser praticamente 30 anos mais novo do que qualquer dos candidatos. Vivemos, estava a brincar obviamente, os 30 anos mais novo, vivemos um tempo de transições, transformações e até há quem utilize a palavra metamorfoses, como, pelo menos em termos da sua velocidade, a humanidade não tinha ainda conhecido. Esses movimentos verdadeiramente tectónicos não podiam e não poderão deixar de envolver a energia, um campo de atividade humana tão importante que abarca direta ou indiretamente mais de 60% da economia mundial. A história do sistema energético moderno, digamos, dos últimos 2 séculos, é fundamentalmente marcada pela utilização crescente dos combustíveis fósseis, neste caso dos 200 anos, petróleo, gás natural, mas também carvão, que naturalmente serve à humanidade há outros 5 séculos, pelo menos. Os combustíveis fósseis representam, assim, hoje cerca de 80%, porventura, há quem diga 85%, depende da forma como se fazem as contas, naturalmente, do consumo das fontes de energia primária. As energias renováveis, energia eólica, solar, hídrica e outras, têm experimentado um aumento exponencial, especialmente na última década. Mas como partiram de uma base muito baixa no mix energético, tem levado tempo a sentir-se o seu efeito, o seu impacto. Em termos absolutos, a contribuição das energias renováveis pode dizer-se que tem representado mais adições, posto que, obviamente, por exemplo, o papel do carvão, em termos absolutos, não tem sequer diminuído, infelizmente, digo eu, mas, portanto, as energias renováveis têm verdadeiramente constituído mais adições do que verdadeiramente transições. Os combustíveis fósseis, e nomeadamente o petróleo, estão na base da prosperidade e do progresso que a humanidade conheceu nos últimos 150 anos. Isto é, obviamente, indiscutável e é sabido que a energia barata e acessível duplicou a expectativa de vida, multiplicou por 7, pelo menos, a população mundial, e estima-se que aumentou em 60 vezes a produção global. Isto é indisputável, mas igualmente indisputável, e por razões que iremos discutir neste painel, esta aceleração na utilização dos combustíveis fósseis conduziu-nos à violação daquilo que alguém já chamou os limites planetários e que permitam, esses limites, que permitem um espaço seguro para a humanidade. É inegável que a utilização maciça de combustíveis fósseis danifica os ecossistemas e que desencadeou as alterações climáticas com que estamos dramaticamente confrontados. Estamos hoje no meio de uma grande transformação que não só irá alterar drasticamente a forma como produzimos e consumimos energia, mas que muito provavelmente também irá transformar as nossas economias, as nossas sociedades e até os sistemas políticos. Eu lembro-me de um livro recentemente publicado, aliás, Global Energy Politics, em que a professora, que está connosco, e é uma das palestrantes deste painel, a professora Karen Beckstrand é citada, aliás, várias vezes, no livro Global Energy Politics, e este livro refere que há 4 grandes realidades, hoje provavelmente chamar-lhe-íamos desafios, que irão ser sentidos a todos os níveis nos próximos anos. Gabinetes ministeriais, conselhos de administração nas nossas casas. Estes 4 desafios, estas 4 novas realidades, é sobre elas que, em boa medida, vamos debruçar nas discussões deste painel, são as seguintes. Primeiro, as alterações climáticas, como já se referiu, e que são hoje uma ameaça existencial para o homem e boa parte da vida, não só humana, como a conhecemos. Segunda, a ascensão da China, que é o maior consumidor de energia, o maior poluidor, o primeiro produtor de carvão a nível mundial e o 5º produtor de petróleo e de gás natural. Na verdade, gás natural não é bem o 5º, é o 7º, mas anda muito próximo da posição que tem enquanto produtor de petróleo. A terceira mudança tectónica é a transição para as energias renováveis, especialmente a energia solar e eólica, e a profunda transformação que esta transição produzirá nos sistemas energéticos nacionais e internacionais. A quarta, e que não é menos importante, é a pobreza energética. Sei que é também um tema caro a mais do que um dos intervenientes neste painel. Trata-se de um problema global e, em última análise, uma questão de segurança. Mais de metade da população mundial está privada ou fortemente limitada no acesso à energia. Não são só os 1.000 milhões de pessoas que não têm eletricidade e que verdadeiramente não sabem o que é um banho de água quente, são também 3.000 milhões que são forçadas a utilizar lenha e outros combustíveis tradicionais para cozinhar e aquecer as suas habitações. A transição para uma sociedade de baixo teor carbónico não vai ser possível se não conseguirmos erradicar a pobreza energética. Tenho a certeza que vamos retomar este tema. Passo agora a apresentar a primeira oradora do nosso painel, a senhora Jennifer Lake. Jennifer, before you take the stand, let me then say something about your professional achievements, since we just have to assume that not everybody read it, and on top of that, perhaps I might be capable of adding something to better understand the outstanding work that you have done in the area of building efficiency and in many other areas related to the transition that we will be certainly working towards. So Jennifer is Global Director of the Energy Program at the World Resources Institute. She co-founded the Building Efficiency Accelerator, which supports 30 cities implementing efficiency projects. Jennifer previously worked in the US Green Power Market Development Group, which she co-created in year 2000. Jennifer's international experience includes consulting for the World Bank and the US EPA on technology transfer for ozone layer protection. She has a BA in Asian and Political Studies and was a student at Nanjing University. Jennifer has an MBA from the University of Michigan Zerb Institute for Sustainability. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Agostino, and to all of the fellow panelists and attendees. It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm really excited about the conference and the way that this conference is developed as an agenda that is interlinked and about systems change and how to steward our global resources, human and natural resources. I am, of course, humbled at this particular moment to be at a crossroads that we had hoped never to face. And yet, with climate change coming at us more dramatically and more quickly than many of us had feared, it is a moment for us to sit back and, as the earlier panel spoke of, rethink our priorities, our models of growth, and our economic development agenda. The science of climate change is ever more clear. When we think about where we were 2 decades ago, a decade ago, and today, we see that, in fact, our window of opportunity is narrowing dramatically, very quickly. 2020 is a pivoting moment, and we never thought we would be here with an unprecedented collapse of our economies, an unprecedented global challenge to our health and our security, and looking now at how we build back, how we rethink our approach. I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 interlinked priorities that we need to focus on to address climate change and the risk that we face due to climate transformation. Those are around technology, around policies, markets, and institutions, and around the re-examination of equity and the services that we provide for people and our populations around the world who are most vulnerable. On technology, this is our good news story. So we should always have a good news story. Technology costs, technology availability is at a point of transformation much more rapid than we had predicted. In the past 2 decades, when I started my career working on renewable energy in 2000, we were looking at single units of PV cells on corporate facilities, on homes, and the costs were prohibitive. Today, PV technology has dramatically increased in its capacity to generate electricity, and the cost has made it so much more available for most of the world's population. In fact, many reports now show that about 2/3 of the globe could use renewable energy as cost effectively or more cost competitively than fossil technologies. That's a dramatic change in where we have been over a decade of time. But we recognize that electricity is not the only part of the energy sector that needs to be transformed. Transportation is equally important. Both electricity and the transportation fuels are systems that have entrenched interests. They have clear manufacturing or use of fuels that is already locked in today. And the question is, how do you change our technology use to enable us to make those shifts more quickly? Transportation has been a good news story. We see electric vehicle technologies coming to scale much more rapidly than the analysts had predicted. In the past 3 years, EV sales have outstripped all expectations in the developed world. When we look at that and we look today at what we can be beginning to think about around transportation, the personal passenger vehicle is one where in the developed world, in Europe and the United States and Canada and elsewhere, we see EV cars coming on board very quickly. The range anxiety, how far do you need to go before you charge again, is also becoming less of an issue for most consumers. But it's not only this that we have to face in the pandemic, we also have to face the questions associated with where and how we think about public transportation, because having a clean vehicle is still going to put you in traffic. It may improve air quality, but it reduces your overall productivity because of time lost due to travel and urbanization, which was one of the themes discussed in the last panel. We certainly know that urbanization is a trend and we must be able to move around our cities. But in an era with COVID, we also know that safety and the concerns around health and safety are also going to be part of that transportation system. So that leads us to the questions associated with institutions and policies and markets. But I want to, before we move off of the questions of technology and the good news story of technology, I want to note that change in technology is not linear. It is an S-shaped curve for those of you who studied the S curves of systems change. There's a pre-development phase where one is looking at the status quo as a norm. It's a comfort zone. There's a takeoff phase, an awareness or an experimentation and innovation phase to this. There's an acceleration phase in technology or in systems change where you see widespread adoption of a new system or a new technology. And then there's either a stabilization at that new level or there's a relapse. And I would posit that we have not yet reached the phase where we've moved from all three stages to a new stabilization phase, even in electricity, because we have to manage for the system change at that final phase, which is around how do you ensure the new pathway is embraced by all, that those who were the old regime have made a just and equitable transition to a new regime. And so you don't have a backsliding or a backlash. Systems change theory is an incredibly important part of the political economy of the energy transition. So in the policies and market space, we have to be aware of that systems change. So let me move from our technology part to our policy and market conversation. The policy and market part is where we really need to recognize that human systems don't evolve as quickly as our technology systems are evolving. Our regulators, our policymakers have to be worrying about what they perceive to be the increased risk because of the new system that we're asking them to adopt, whether that's around variability of electricity, whether it's around the recognition of the battery range and the replacements for the batteries. All of these are important parts of what the policy community needs to navigate and manage. What we know today about the COVID response is that our systems have not fully embraced, our policymakers have not fully embraced these new systems. Globally, if you look at the first round of COVID investments that have been made in our economy, about $168 billion went towards fossil fuel electricity and power, so reinforcing that old system. About 137 billion, not even half, of that investment went to clean electricity and systems. So we know that right now we are in the midst of these two systems competing. What we need to do now is look at where there's an opportunity to phase out of the kinds of subsidies and incentives that have maintained those old status quos, move us out of this status quo and into the new economies of energy. When we looked at some of the information around where and how the economy could be shifting, we looked at some of the jobs numbers. In the United States, for example, the Energy Futures Initiative examined the energy jobs, and they found that about 2.38 million jobs are in efficiency. That can be in construction, that could be in equipment, but 2.38 million US workers are now working on energy efficiency. And that's dramatic. That's as many jobs as are in the motor vehicle industries in the United States. So this is not a small niche activity. This is becoming more mainstream and integrated into our economy, but it's under-recognized as a political constituency. And so the politics of clean energy are not yet matured. I look at the building sector, and I know Agostino mentioned that's one of the things that I have also worked in. The building sector consistently lags as one of those sectors that has not yet reached its area of improvement that needs to be part of what the IEA says is a global third of improvement for or change that's needed in the energy sector. So we're now at about 1 to maybe 1.5% improvement in energy efficiency, and we need to be at 3% annually. So that is a doubling of the rate of investment that we need in energy efficiency. It's not a small number. And we know that our construction sector could be deployed much more successfully, especially in the developing world where that lock-in effect has not yet occurred and where energy efficiency could help us avoid the need for new fossil fuel or other types of power sector investments on the supply side. Managing the demand curve is a huge and important strategy, which our policymakers have not yet begun to invest in adequately. We need to improve efficiency, and we need to make investments improved by a factor of 5. That's a huge amount of money that we have to be building into our economy. But we need to do that equitably. We need to look at the legacy of the economies of old, which were around extraction and production. So if we're really serious about changing that demand curve, our economic models need to shift, and we need to recognize those who have been left out. In the solar home space, we have the merge of technology, and we have the opportunity to improve our equitable access to energy technologies. So it's not the only area where we need to improve, and I look at the kinds of strategies that are coming out of Sustainable Energy for All, Powering Africa, a number of different institutions. But we have to look at some of those vulnerabilities that are particularly acute. And the heat vulnerability, which will increase with climate change, is one of those areas, just like COVID, that will hit our most vulnerable populations the hardest. Heat vulnerability can be achieved, can be mitigated via roofing, cool surfaces, green infrastructure. And we need to make sure that we are not sending our last, most inefficient technologies into the developing world, but instead finding a mechanism to build a technology future in the right ways for countries to bring more people into a clean energy economy. I look forward to talking more about this, but I'll end my formal opening comments here, and I'll wait for the discussion to talk more. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Quite exciting. And specifically for the Portuguese audience, as the efficiency, and specifically the efficiency of buildings, is of paramount importance and a top priority for the European Union, as no doubt you know, in our climate mitigating strategies. So I now would like to say a little bit more about Miguel Bastos Araújo. He is a professor at the Spanish Research Council and professor of biogeography at the University of Évora. Miguel is recognized as a world leader in the study of climate change effects on biodiversity. He lectured and researched at Imperial College, Universities of Oxford, Copenhagen, at CNRC, etc. He has won many prizes and accolades in Portugal and elsewhere. I am particularly intent on pointing out that in 2018, Miguel won the very prestigious Prêmio Pessoa, the Pessoa Prize, and this was the first time ever that the environmental sciences were awarded one of the most important prizes that exist in Portugal. Miguel graduated from the University College of London, and he has co-authored a number of books in his area of specialty. Miguel, on to you.
Muito obrigado, Agostinho, pela introdução e muito obrigado ao Clube de Lisboa pelo amável convite para estar aqui. É uma pena não podermos estar cara a cara, em pessoa. Melhores tempos virão. Também queria saudar o painel. É um prazer poder hoje conversar com vocês e, naturalmente, todo o público que está aqui a ouvir-nos. Nós tínhamos conversado antes e eu já sabia que a Jennifer ia falar mais do ângulo tecnológico da questão da transição climática, portanto eu abstenho de referir esse tema, para podermos revisitar no debate, e optei por falar por o que nós podemos chamar o patinho feio da área da transição energética, que é o papel do mundo biológico nesta história toda. E, se me permitirem, eu passarei a partilhar alguns slides, porque às vezes há imagens que valem mais que 1000 palavras. Pronto, vamos lá tentar. Agostinho, está-se a ver bem?
Uhum.
Está-se a ver?
Okay. Sim, sim.
Pronto. Muito bem. Esta animação é um GIF. Representa a produtividade primária bruta do planeta, ou seja, a energia processada pelos ecossistemas, pelas plantas, através da fotossíntese, portanto, que capturam energia solar e a transformam em energia química, que tem uma parte dessa energia é transformada em matéria, portanto, em carbono, e há uma outra parte que é usada para o processo de respiração. Portanto, isto é basicamente o processo de fotossíntese que todos conhecemos, e como vocês veem, à medida que os meses do ano passam, há áreas do planeta que produzem mais e outros que produzem menos, e, portanto, que emitem mais. Os que produzem mais, nos momentos em que produzem mais, emitem mais CO2. Pronto. Temos um cômputo global de 150 terawatts de energia processada em meio terrestre e 115 terawatts no oceano. Portanto, 150 em terra, 115 no mar. Isto são números impressionantes, mas são só 0,2% da energia solar que chega ao planeta Terra. Portanto, há muita energia que não é usada pelo sistema biológico. E vocês dirão, mas o que é que isto tem a ver com a transição económica e a transição energética? Eu diria que tem tudo. Tem tudo porque, se nós olharmos para as curvas de consumo energético no planeta, e são umas curvas muito conhecidas, portanto isto é tirado da internet, nós vemos em azul em baixo a quantidade de biomassa, portanto a biomassa, a energia que nós nos apropriamos, energia de plantas, energia de animais, que no fundo decorrem deste processo de metabolização da energia solar. E como veem, no princípio do tempo, nós exclusivamente vivíamos desse tipo de energia, não é? E com o passar do tempo passamos a diversificar para outras fontes de energia. Mas as outras fontes de energia, se vocês têm aqui, temos o carvão, temos o petróleo, temos o gás natural, que fazem grande parte do consumo energético que temos hoje, também são energia metabolizada pelas plantas. Portanto, foram obtidos pelo mesmo processo e depois fossilizaram de maneira diferente, gerando estas formas diferentes de energia. Portanto, é por isso que eu digo muitas vezes que nós estamos a viver a crédito, porque no fundo continuamos a usar energia metabolizada pelas plantas, mas não aquela que é produzida hoje, mas aquela que foi produzida há milhões de anos atrás. mas a nossa dependência da fotossíntese para nos alimentarmos, para nos aquecermos, para nos movermos, é extremamente grande. Depois temos também a fonte hidroelétrica, mas a fonte hidroelétrica, em última análise, depende do ciclo da água, e o ciclo da água não é independente também do que se passa nos ecossistemas da biosfera. Portanto, sem biosfera, a maior parte da água iria parar ao mar, sem infiltração no solo, portanto não havia regularização do regime hidrológico, seria muito mais instável, portanto muito diferente, portanto reduzindo muito a nossa capacidade também de obter energia por esta via. Realmente só neste mix, só a energia nuclear é que é de certo modo independente do sistema biológico de captura da energia solar e transformação em energia química. E no futuro não será muito diferente disso. Nós aqui temos como é que o mix de energias irá evoluir, enfim, isto é uma projeção feita por volta de 2015 até 2035, temos os valores absolutos à esquerda e o share, portanto a percentagem à direita, e podem ver que há a emergência aqui das energias renováveis, que está a aumentar, ainda com um peso relativamente pequeno, mas, como disse a Jennifer, com expectativas de aumentar bastante. Mas esta curva inclui biomassa, inclui biofuels, portanto, inclui também energia metabolizada pelas plantas, portanto, com emissões de CO2. Não é tudo energia limpa, nem é tudo energia que não afeta a viabilidade da vida no planeta. Portanto, é muito importante termos presentes esta nossa forte dependência, no fundo, da biodiversidade e do mundo vivo, como mecanismo a partir do qual nós nos apropriamos da energia solar. Foi assim durante toda a história da humanidade e é improvável que nas próximas décadas nós não dependamos ainda bastante destas formas de energia. Portanto, o que temos aqui é um gráfico do IPCC, uma espécie de cartoon de estoques e fluxos de carbono. Portanto, os quadrados são estoques e as setas são fluxos. E basicamente isto é para fazer o ponto de que, portanto, o petróleo representa cerca de 300 gigatoneladas de carbono, temos 3.000 de carvão, portanto, isto são os volumes que temos, em princípio, as expectativas de reservas que temos de carbono fóssil. Temos bastante mais no solo, face ao carbono fóssil, e a biosfera tem também, a biosfera terrestre, um valor de 610 gigatoneladas. Ora, isto são valores muito superiores àquilo que nós no dia-a-dia emitimos, e, portanto, do ciclo de carbono da nossa atividade sociometabólica. O oceano desempenha também um papel importantíssimo, e se nos referimos então ao fundo dos oceanos, temos aqui a capacidade para destabilizar totalmente o ciclo de carbono global, caso nós tenhamos uma intervenção menos feliz neste sistema. Portanto, nós, hoje em dia, prepararmos para a transição energética e para um mundo com alterações climáticas implica não sermos apenas utilizadores, de certo modo inadvertidos, do ciclo de carbono, mas nós temos de ser gestores deste ciclo de carbono. A nossa importância no processo de afetação do ciclo é tão grande que já não nos podemos apenas confiar que a natureza fará o seu trabalho. Portanto, nós, se queremos manter as nossas atividades e o equilíbrio planetário, temos que atuar como caretakers, como stewards deste espaço. E aqui vai o centro daquilo que eu vos queria falar hoje. Portanto, o primeiro ponto é, de facto, convencer-vos de que os ecossistemas naturais têm que ser geridos, são uma parte muito importante do processo de gestão da energia, do processo de gestão das emissões, e o segundo aspecto é que grande parte do impacto que nós temos na gestão dos ecossistemas tem a ver com a agricultura. Depois podíamos falar de questões específicas do gelo do permafrost, podemos falar das pescas, podemos falar da gestão florestal, portanto, que não tem a ver com a desflorestação, mas a gestão propriamente florestal, mas eu não vou falar nisso, portanto, vou falar na agricultura. E porquê? Bom, isto é um gráfico que basicamente é um gráfico um pai, não é? Que nos dá um bocadinho a ideia de qual é que é o mix em termos de emissões de diferentes atividades. E temos basicamente as atividades não associadas à agricultura, estão aqui à esquerda, sensivelmente 50% das emissões, e depois temos os outros 50% associados à atividade agrícola, quer seja pela agricultura propriamente dita, 11 a 15%, mas também 15 a 16% de alterações do uso de solo e desflorestação, e depois todo o processo de desperdício e também de a parte industrial associada à agricultura, portanto, o transporte, as embalagens, etc. Portanto, de facto, temos aqui um sistema que não pode ser negligenciado quando nós falamos em transição energética. E há pouco tivemos uma conversa, quer dizer, ouvimos o painel anterior que falou, tinha uma visão otimista quanto à progressão da demografia no futuro, e eu estou muito contente com essa visão e espero que aconteça, mas nós, de momento, quer dizer, nas últimas 5 décadas, desde 1960 aproximadamente, temos vindo a acrescentar 1.000 milhões de pessoas, ou seja, 1 bilhão em inglês, não é? 1 billion, 1.000 milhões de pessoas por década no planeta. Portanto, já vão 5 milhões de pessoas desde que eu nasci. Isto, para pôr um bocadinho o contexto, no princípio da Revolução Industrial nós tínhamos 1.000 milhões de pessoas no planeta. Portanto, seria provavelmente um máximo histórico em toda a evolução, toda a história da humanidade, e nós neste momento estamos a acrescentar 1.000 milhões e ainda vamos continuar a acrescentar. É verdade que as taxas de crescimento demográfico estão a abrandar, como será o futuro. Bom, há cenários, não é? Mas é muito provável que continue a abrandar e que em algum momento haja uma decaída dos efetivos populacionais globais, mas o que é certo é que a realidade atual e possivelmente a realidade das próximas décadas imediatas é que continuaremos a crescer. E este crescimento, enfim, não há, quer dizer, obviamente que cabe muito mais gente no planeta, portanto a questão não é falta de espaço. A questão é que estas pessoas consomem recursos, consomem o tal metabolismo das plantas e dos ecossistemas. Nós aqui à esquerda temos uma representação do aumento de consumo per capita, gramas per capita por pessoa. Portanto, vemos que há um ligeiro aumento, não é uma coisa enorme, mas quer dizer, à medida que as pessoas têm mais dinheiro, portanto, consomem mais, sabemos que existem ciclos de consumo. Portanto, nós partimos das classes mais desfavorecidas, portanto, com menos acesso a recursos financeiros e menos acesso a alimento. À medida que têm mais recursos, comem mais, não é? Até que chega uma altura onde, satisfeitas as necessidades básicas de calorias, passa-se a uma segunda fase, que é a fase de maior diversificação dos produtos alimentares, uma focagem na questão da qualidade dos alimentos, portanto, o prazer de comer, etc. Portanto, isso tem a ver com o aumento das classes médias. Depois temos um terceiro fenómeno, que digamos que é um fenómeno pós-moderno, onde as pessoas já se começam a preocupar não só com a qualidade dos alimentos, mas com a qualidade dos processos que geram esses alimentos. Portanto, começam-se a preocupar com, por exemplo, os impactos ambientais de determinada comida, se são produzidos em proximidade, se vêm de longe, se tem uma pegada carbónica elevada, etc. Portanto, mas isso é um fenómeno bastante recente. É um fenómeno do primeiro mundo, portanto, das partes do mundo mais afluentes e com mais consciência das questões ambientais. A verdade é que temos vindo a aumentar, as projeções continuam no sentido de aumento, portanto, a última barra é 2030, e à direita temos, portanto, o consumo total agregado por ano. Portanto, estamos aí com um crescimento muito maior do que o crescimento per capita. Isto tem-se feito essencialmente à custa de um aumento da área agrícola nos países a vermelho, portanto, os países que estão aqui vermelho neste mapa, portanto, em redor da linha do Equador e no hemisfério sul, em grande parte, estão a incrementar a sua área agrícola, e as áreas a verde são as áreas onde se está a moderar a expansão da área agrícola e, em certos casos, até a reduzir, portanto, com o aumento da área florestal, etc. Isto em termos... Isto é até 2011, mas nós na última década temos tido um incremento muito grande de área agrícola, que neste caso se traduz em desflorestação, portanto em desflorestação, em perda de área de floresta, e não é uma floresta qualquer, são florestas tropicais biodiversas, em particular no Sudeste Asiático, também nas savanas do leste africano, no sul do Sudão em áreas úmidas, e áreas úmidas também em outras partes do planeta, a bacia do Congo. Depois no Brasil é conhecido o caso da desflorestação nas áreas de cerrado brasileiro, que no fundo é uma savana brasileira, se quiserem, e também o caso mais conhecido da Amazónia. Portanto, as imagens têm outro peso, não é? Portanto, à esquerda tem uma imagem de desflorestação no Amazonas, muito recente, uma foto do Guardian, para a expansão da área agrícola, portanto, a área agropecuária, e o mesmo a acontecer no Sudeste Asiático, com florestas extremamente sensíveis, praticamente muito difíceis de recuperar, onde está a florestar em grande massa para a agricultura, em particular para a produção do óleo de palma. Portanto, há este aumento de consumo de energia das plantas, portanto, de calorias, está a aumentar a área do planeta. Portanto, nós tivemos já estas crises em termos de alimento no passado, quer dizer, o relatório de Roma, o Malthus referia isso, e sempre conseguimos compensar de alguma maneira o crescimento populacional e a produção de alimento com uma revolução tecnológica. A tecnologia permitiu ganhos de produtividade, mas agora é evidente que não chega. Não chega porque estamos a crescer muito demograficamente e, além de ganhos de produtividade, temos de ter também ganhos de área. Mesmo assim, portanto, isto é uma curva também de crescimento de consumo energético associado à agricultura, portanto, à atividade agrícola. Vemos que as curvas à esquerda é biomassa e petróleo, portanto, basicamente está estagnado, mas há um aumento muito grande de consumo de energia elétrica. E também, não é energia, mas é água, que é um dos aspectos essenciais. Portanto, nós temos aqui o uso da água em diferentes setores e, portanto, a verde escuro, neste caso, temos aquilo que é obtido dos sistemas, do ecossistemas, e a verde claro aquilo que é efetivamente usado. Portanto, vemos que há um gap, não é? Há um hiato entre as duas barras, o que representa o desperdício, waste. Isso existe em todas as atividades, portanto, o desperdício, tanto na parte industrial como na parte doméstica, e naturalmente há muito que se pode fazer em termos de redução deste desperdício para ganhar eficiência energética neste setor de atividade. Pronto, eu agora gostava de referir soluções, porque este é um quadro, obviamente, é um quadro muito negro. Eu sou uma pessoa otimista por natureza e gosto sempre de procurar as soluções perante os problemas, depois se conseguimos ou não, isso é outra questão. Mas eu penso que há aqui na área, no lado da procura, porque aqui podemos pensar em termos de um problema de procura e de oferta. Do lado da procura, o primeiro passo é empoderar o consumidor. Eu referi há pouco que nesta terceira fase demográfica, da relação entre a demografia e as condições socioeconómicas e a comida, as pessoas começam a estar mais preocupadas, mais conscientes de que as suas escolhas alimentares, a sua alimentação, reflete-se no tipo de paisagens que nós temos, mas também na pressão energética e no conjunto de emissões de CO2 que nós emitimos. Portanto, é muito importante que a pessoa, quando vai ao supermercado, tenha a capacidade de saber exatamente qual é que é a pegada carbónica e já agora a pegada em termos de biodiversidade do alimento que está a comer. Suponhamos que há uma escala que vai de A a E, como na certificação energética, e nós podíamos dizer que, enfim, eu como consumidor quero comer tudo de escala A a B, eventualmente C. E descartar, portanto, a parte E e B. Pronto, isso em função da consciencialização do consumidor e eventualmente até do seu poder de compra. Há aqui pequenas decisões individuais que podem ser feitas que depois têm um efeito em cadeia, em toda a cadeia de produção e, portanto, também de consumo. Depois é a questão referida por todos os organismos internacionais da otimização do consumo. Portanto, nem todo produto alimentar tem o mesmo impacto, quer em termos de CO2 como de biodiversidade. Por exemplo, em termos de produção calorífica, nós quando comemos carne de vaca, no fundo temos 2%, nós ingerimos 2% das calorias que são usadas no processo produtivo daqueles 2%. Portanto, há 98% de calorias que se perdem no processo produtivo. E quanto mais perto nós estamos da origem, portanto, do produtor, a planta, menos perdas energéticas existem nesta cadeia. Portanto, a vaca é um dos exemplos de maior ineficiência na conversão de calorias, mas depois temos os porcos que são um bocadinho mais eficientes, as galinhas e os coelhos que são ainda mais. Portanto, temos aqui, há opções que podem ser feitas de otimização e que naturalmente estaria refletido no sistema de certificação, portanto, o meu primeiro ponto. E depois há a redução do desperdício. O cálculo oficial anda nos 30% de desperdício em termos de produção alimentar, portanto 30% de energia que se perde. Há quem aponte que é superior, que é 5%. Há que distinguir o desperdício nos países mais ricos e nos países mais pobres. Nos países mais pobres o desperdício não é feito ao nível do consumidor. Os consumidores não se podem dar ao luxo de desperdiçar a comida que têm no frigorífico, não é? Portanto, têm que comer tudo, aproveitam tudo. A própria cultura portuguesa, no passado, era uma cultura onde nós temos uma série de pratos de gastronomia popular, que, enfim, a roupa velha, a sopa da pedra, portanto, que são coisas, são receitas, formas de cozinhar, digamos assim, que tinham como base esta ideia de aproveitar a comida e de não haver desperdício. Portanto, nos países pobres, o desperdício é principalmente ao nível da produção. Portanto, falta de investimento em condições adequadas para armazenamento das culturas, o que leva a perdas enormes, com pragas, com ratos, etc. E com apodrecimento. Portanto, no lado dos países ricos, é de facto uma questão de consumo, e aí, pronto, há uma série de medidas que podem ser tomadas, eu não vou agora aqui detalhar. Finalmente, do lado da oferta, eu penso que é a questão mais complexa, não é? Por um lado, também já existe um consenso ao nível das Nações Unidas e também da União Europeia, que nós temos que blindar a parte do território à exploração. Isto passa por um reforço da capacidade de gestão de espaços naturais protegidos, portanto, de áreas protegidas, e uma eventual expansão. Portanto, a meta até 2030, oficial neste momento na Europa, e possivelmente será adotada, ou esperemos em breve, no próximo ano, na COP15, é de preservação de 30% da área planetária, tanto ao nível terrestre como marinho. Portanto, áreas de território que não são usadas primordialmente para a atividade económica. Também tem atividade económica, nomeadamente turística e outra, e também pode ser feita a produção agrícola nesses espaços, mas digamos que os objetivos de gestão são subjugados aos objetivos de conservação. Há quem fale numa eventual expansão para 2050, mas pronto, isso já serão outras gerações. Nenhum de nós que está aqui a conversar será responsável por tomar essa decisão. Portanto, isto é, digamos, uma abordagem clássica, quase que numa lógica de seguros, não é? Se falharmos na nossa gestão sustentável do planeta, temos aqui um backup, não é? Temos aqui um backup de natureza que garante que isto não entre em colapso total. E depois temos uma outra coisa que me parece evidente, que é difícil do ponto de vista técnico, mas nós temos que testar diferentes modos de produção sustentável intensiva, ou seja, a agricultura intensiva é necessário. É necessário uma intensificação da agricultura sustentável, porque a alternativa é o aumento ainda maior da área agrícola, até que perdamos todos os ecossistemas naturais do planeta. Agora, como é que isto se faz? Se faz com a agricultura biológica, a agricultura biodinâmica, agricultura intensiva, mais de estilo industrial. Bom, eu acho que aqui é uma discussão que é preciso ter, uma discussão técnica que não cabe. Realmente, eu penso que temos como objetivo, não há forma de evitar a questão da intensificação sustentável. E atenção à água, porque de facto a água é um recurso escasso. O objetivo do painel não é falar de água, mas temos aqui um problema. Bom, para finalizar, só referir que tudo o que eu tive aqui a dizer, enfim, nós temos aqui um problema que é o chamado uma incerteza que nós sabemos que existe, ou seja, todas as projeções prevêem alterações climáticas, no regime de temperaturas, de precipitação, que vão gerar alterações na produtividade primária dos ecossistemas. Portanto, aquele mapa inicial que mostrava o crescimento da produtividade e o decrescimento em função da época do ano, mas, portanto, em termos agregados, estas áreas a vermelho são áreas onde vai haver perda de produtividade primária e, portanto, perda de produtividade agrícola, porque as plantas são plantas, não é? Não são desligadas do processo naturalmente com a agricultura, a tecnologia, podemos regar, etc. Podemos tentar contrariar estes processos, mas há um limite naquilo que nós podemos fazer, até porque se chover menos, haverá menos água. Portanto, este é um known unknown. E depois temos ainda os unknown unknowns, que na realidade não são assim tão incertos. Aquilo que não sabemos que não sabemos. Na realidade sabemos. Nós estamos obcecados com o final do século, mas o século não vai acabar, o mundo não vai acabar no final do século, esperemos. E, portanto, as alterações climáticas continuarão. Por exemplo, este mapa aqui anterior, a Groenlândia aparece aqui a cinzento, como uma área onde basicamente não há perdas nem há ganhos, porque não há agricultura, não é? Mas já a Dinamarca já começa a discutir as oportunidades que há em termos de produção agrícola na Groenlândia à medida que as alterações climáticas progridem. Não foi por acaso que o Presidente dos Estados Unidos, Trump, quis comprar a Groenlândia, porque, quer dizer, sabe-se que aquilo que é um ativo fortíssimo no futuro, que poderá baralhar um bocadinho as contas que eu aqui apresentei. Mas pronto, mas isso é algo que nós não sabemos, mas poderão haver ameaças, claramente, aquele mapa a vermelho, não é? Mas também há eventualmente algumas oportunidades no futuro que também poderão ter outro tipo de ameaças seguintes em termos de impactos subsequentes. Portanto, eu acho que como introdução ao ponto da questão energética desde a perspectiva de gestão dos ecossistemas e da obtenção de comida, era o que eu queria dizer para já. Muito obrigado. E vou tirar, se conseguir, a stop sharing aqui. Já está.
Obrigado. Obrigado, Miguel. Não vai ser penalizado por ter... well, back to English. I suspect that I should say it in English. Yeah, no penalties for excessive time. In fact, not excessive, just a little bit of an excess. But that's just because you are a native, and we tend to have most favorable treatment. Thank you. It was well, a number of thought-provoking findings, and I'm sorry, Karen, for waiting. And as we say in Portuguese, the last shall be the first, and you certainly are the first in terms of producing books. I found no less than three books that you wrote so far, probably more. And I thought that Rethinking the Green State should be a very, very, I suspect is the last one that you wrote, should be a very, very interesting book. So on to your career. You are a professor in environmental social science at Stockholm University and a researcher, a senior researcher at the Institute for Future Studies. Karen is a member of the Swedish government's Climate Policy Council and has been a visiting professor at University of Oxford, as well as at MIT. Karen's research is focused on global environmental politics, non-state actors in climate change governance after the Paris Agreement, and the democratic legitimacy of global governance. Thank you. The floor is yours, Karen. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this very timely conference. And I really enjoyed the panel's presentations by Mikkel and Jennifer, and for the kind introduction. And I thought here during my 10 minutes or so, I will take a political science and international relations angle on the climate crisis and its now nexus with the COVID pandemic. And so I'm just, before I start my reflections here, I should say that as I'm very interested in my research centers on the governance toward low carbon society and the role of state and non-state actors, be it civil society, business and trade union in the transformation. So how do we actually govern both globally to a carbon neutral society, to decarbonization and renewables? How do we do that and secure effectiveness and legitimacy of among citizens? So I think that's an important issue, especially in the times of nationalism and populism. How can governments secure democratic support for far-reaching societal transformation to fossil-free society? And I will return a little bit to this in my talk. But I start with, and I think both Mikkel and Jennifer gave us a good foundation for my presentation, so I will focus on the politics. So 2020 was supposed to be the super year for climate and environmental action, with the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow in November, with new nationally determined contributions by the states. The EU Green Deal was presented in December, and a proposal for an EU new climate law on that EU is going to be a carbon-free continent in 2050. And all the things from 2019 was a kind of acceleration toward this. We had the UN Climate Summit in New York, where Greta Thunberg spoke, the new commission. So everything was set up for the super year 2020. And then came Corona. So I want to speak about the aspects on the nexus of COVID-19 and climate change. What is the impact for the international and multilateral EU framework of the COVID crisis? And that's the first I will talk about, because I think it's extremely important in this double crisis we have now of the pandemic and climate change, that the multilateral EU framework and international collaboration are working. That's very central. Then a bit on the impact on the climate. What is actually the impact of COVID on climate and air pollution? We see that there is a decrease of greenhouse gas emissions and there is improved air pollution, but as many argue, and I will argue, these are just temporary reductions in emissions. And like the financial crisis 2008, if we don't transform our transport systems, our lifestyles, we will be back in the same tracks again. Thirdly, I want to also, and this is an underlying question, this is the million-dollar question, will COVID-19 accelerate the climate transition and the renewable energy transition, or will it cause a carbon lock-in as jobs and the economy is receiving higher priority? So, and here I should say, and maybe I should be a bit optimistic, I see myself as an optimistic realist or optimist against better knowing, but I think COVID is this crisis or window of opportunity. And as many say, don't waste the opportunity of a crisis. I think Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go wasted. So I think there are some positive signs that we transformed our lifestyles in a few months because of a deadly pandemic. Can we retain some of these transformations, such as the digitalizations, and with climate change? That's the key question. But first, to the question on the consequences for global collaboration on the COVID crisis. I think this is extremely important because right now, the global, for example, the UN conference on climate change is postponed to 2021 in Glasgow. We need to really keep the ambition countries up to report new and more ambitious target to comply with the Paris Agreement. So the consequences, I think, are very. I was first very worried that I come to this because both COVID and climate are prime example of global collective action problem that can only be handled in a global response by almost 200 states and multilaterally. So the virus doesn't respect borders, the carbon emissions doesn't respect borders, and the consequences for COVID-19 and climate change is additionally worse for the global south and developing countries with weaker, that are vulnerable and with weaker health system. So climate change and also biodiversity that was talked about and COVID are very linked, multiple cascading crises. And this is extremely important that they are handled by strong multilateral global institutions. And therefore, it's a paradox that initially during the crisis, states acted very unilaterally and very nationally according to a sovereign logic. And we saw that also in EU with the initial non-coordination of activities. And of course, issues such as populism and nationalism reinforced this. We see now consequences. US is wanting to exit from leave the World Health Organization. That undermines, of course, the multilateral framework. The same that Donald Trump wanted to, has left the Paris Agreement. We have seen, and now the United Kingdom have left the EU with the Brexit. And of course, it's very easy to be pessimistic here, because this form of nationalism, populism, and undermining of multilateral organizations is a disaster for global institutions. But it also shows that these countries who retreat from multilateralism, US, Brazil, and also UK, that the consequences for the economy is not good. So it's the perfect illustration that alone is not strong. And I think, to be more positive here, after the immediate crisis, EU acted more coordinated, and now with the next generation, the Corona saving package and the Green Deal, which shows the importance of global and regional institutions that can coordinate country strategies and allocate resources according to just principle. So in that sense, I think now, 9 or 6 months into the pandemic, we can see the first seeds to a green recovery in the form of EU deals. And here's some reasons why I think I'm optimistic. First, compared to if we look on the financial crisis 2008, many hoped for a new green recovery, a transformation toward fossil-free society. It didn't happen. But now there are other conditions met that I think can make us more optimistic. We had a momentum in 2019 with the Fridays for Future, the Greta Thunberg, very proud that she's a Swede like me. And that shifted public opinion in so many countries, and shifted also, if we look on the European Union, the majority of EU citizens thinks climate change is a real problem that EU should tackle. We also, secondly, see a momentum from the private sector and business, the green and green energy, wind, renewable energy industry that want to be part of this transition and of circular economy. Third, we had lots of existing legislation in place, both in countries with new climate laws compared to the 2008, and we have the Green New Deal in the European Union and the EU law, EU climate law. So that's an additional factor. And also, fourth, I think leadership is extremely important in these situation. And looking on the EU again, we had a new commission with Ursula von der Leyen and Frans Timmermans, who pushed really to keep to the Green Deal even through the pandemic. And that leadership is very important. And of course, needless to say, a contrast to the non-leadership of the American president. So this all is very important. And I want to stress the global perspective, because also we focus very much on our countries now. How should we solve the pandemic nationally? But we need to work on strengthen the development cooperation for aid for the global south. Countries like Peru, South Africa are very hit by the pandemic, and they also need climate funding. I realize I shouldn't talk too much, but just to say some lesson learned. And also I should say that there are, of course, the pandemic has led to positive environmental effects. Air pollution has gone down in many cities. Biological diversity has been restored because of the less of car transport and industrial production. So we can see positive impacts. And also the global greenhouse gas emissions have gone down because the two greenhouse gas giants in the world, China and US, have had an economic recession. But it's very important to say this will not be long-term. They might be short-term, these effects that show the financial crisis. So I'm ending up here soon with some lesson learned. And I think, I mean, Corona, we need to think, policymakers, academics, the private sector, multiple crises beyond silos. The Corona, the climate, and the biological diversity, they are linked, triple threats. That is a threat to our society. They are linked because the virus is also spread between humans and animals, and it's caused by, for example, our very detrimental and also from an animal rights perspective, industrial farming's markets. So we need to have a holistic way to look on solving the climate crisis, biological diversity, and pandemic through international and EU collaboration. Because all these threats, they are deadly. I mean, Corona is deadly, in that we see with 1 million dead. A deadly threat. Climate change is deadly, both short-term and long-term, causing temperature rises, fires, killing people. So we need to be very smart and work and collaborate on these pieces. And I think, again, I want to stress, I think it's a window of opportunity. And then I actually want to end with, and I hope you don't count this as too much of a promotion, but I have a very new book out. And the reason I can promote this is because it's open access. So anyone can go to Cambridge University Press website and for free read this book, Governing the Climate Energy Nexus, the Challenges to Coherence, Legitimacy and Effectiveness. And it looks on the climate and energy crisis, coupled crisis, edited with dear colleagues from Lund University and Stockholm University. So that's for free. So you don't need to buy it. And I just had 10-15 minutes here, but if you want to learn more about these coupled crises, please go to Cambridge University websites and you can read more. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Fascinating. By the way, it will be free for us, but not for you. You're going to be charged for or maybe the university will be charged for the marketing effort. Okay, so we still have time. I suspect 12 minutes or so. We have a couple of questions on our Q&A, and I would direct the first one to Jennifer, if you don't mind. And it has to do with the recycling of renewable assets. So I will read it for you. Whoops. Yeah, here it is. How does future recycling costs of solar panels and eolic generators impact the actual viability of a transition to green energy? ? Could some countries start specializing in this recycling, is the question, Jennifer.
It's a very good question, and thank you to the questioner. There are several things that are going to be important around the new energy technology space. First, I would point to the need for mining and extraction and new practices associated with mining and extraction. We know already that there is a legacy of mining and extraction that has been exploiting local populations, excluding people from the benefits associated with those mineral rights, not recognizing indigenous lands, and a myriad of governance issues that are going to be important to tackle as we look at the extraction part of the equation. Secondly, there's the in-use phase. We need to look and ensure that we have processes for the development of these technologies that allow for sort of a design for reuse, taking those components, those elements that can be reused and reintegrated into the systems in a closed loop way, looking at a circular economy approach. And then finally, an end-of-life phase for all technologies that needs to be consistent with a circular economy approaches. That recycling approach is something that is very new. We certainly have seen it in the upscaling of wind turbines. We do know that those have been designed for disassembly. In many instances, they can be upscaled, upgraded. Solar PV systems are lagging behind in that regard. We know that electronic vehicle batteries are being used as energy storage within the power system. So we know that there is the opportunity to think holistically about these elements and these components, but the recycling industry and the recycling infrastructure does not yet have opportunities for recollection of those materials and reuse, or a design for disassembly approach. So that circular economy approach and how we think about it, and whether countries are able to invest in making that infrastructure, is very important. I want to say one more thing about this, and that is that in advocating for recycling, it has been the case that many components and elements of e-waste have been shipped to poorer countries, which are then strapped with the toxic materials that are associated with the technologies. And we have to prevent that type of environmental injustice from happening again, even as we try to solve for our energy problems. So, very good question.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very good answer indeed, particularly taking into account that, say, a wind turbine, it takes a lot of concrete, a lot of iron to build those little monsters. No less than 1,500 tons of iron, 2,500 tons of concrete, 45 tons of plastic. That's the numbers I read somewhere. So now this, thank you very much. It's very good to know that efforts are being made to recycle and give a destiny that is compatible with environmental concerns. Thank you. The next question that I have in Q&A is for Karen, if I may, and it reads as follows. You can see that is from a lawyer. I know this one, Bruno Antunes. So it takes a few lines, and I'll read it slowly to permit a good translation. Following up on the important comment on multilateralism, I would like to ask Ms. Beckstrand if she thinks that recent plurilateral initiatives can fit and give impetus to multilateral efforts for a sustainable future, or if, on the other hand, can create a tiered system that leaves some countries out of the consensus building process and thus undermine global cooperation and multilateralism. Here you have it, Karen.
Yes, I must say thank you for that excellent question. That is a core question for many international relations scholars. If we mean by plurilateral, that is collaboration between states in clubs, so-called clubs outside the multilateral system, that can be, it can be very positive that outside the UN system of 200 states, it could be good that states come together and form collaboration. For example, there are collaborations on the phase out of fossil-free subsidies among many countries, not all the UN countries who work to phase out. That's a club, so to speak, or plurilateral initiative that can feed on to the multilateral process. There are also technology collaboration, bilateral, trilateral, between countries that complement multilateralism. But of course, the question also shows the danger. Who is in and who is out? Multilateralism is for the weak, the small states. Multilateralism ensures fair and transparent and open within the UN process making. There can also be, I could imagine, fossil fuel clubs that also been lobbyists among oil industry, oil producing countries that try to block framework. So yes, extremely good question, but double-edged. It can help plurilateral initiatives, but it can also undermine.
Thank you, Karen. We have two other Q&A questions, but since none of those fits with Miguel's presentation, I would articulate one for him of my own initiative. So, Miguel, no doubt you are familiar with the writings of James Lovelock, and in listening to you, I found that perhaps, as some people say, when Lovelock says that the Earth is just not compatible with the what he thinks is a plague of humans. We are too many, and we just happen to reproduce at a rate that the Earth cannot put up with all our demands. And so James Lovelock, in his most recent book, which is out, I think it was published last year, comes up with this idea that the best we can do is really to use the materials that we have so as to create some form of new humanity called cyborgs, cyber organisms. And what he tells us is, forget it, we'll never solve the climate dramatic challenges that we have before us. We'll need other forms of intelligence. And so the best we can do is to be the bridge to these new forms of intelligence, which he calls cyber organisms, as I said. And then perhaps they will help us solve the climate problems that we have. And finally, the Earth will be enough, not only the Earth resources will be enough to accommodate us and the cyborgs. Do you have, I know that this does not fit entirely with your presentation, but do you have a comment on this way of looking at things?
Thank you. This is a big question. But before, perhaps I'll just like to comment on the previous question, but very quickly. If you look at the rates of emission of China, US, and European Union, it's basically half of all emissions in the world. So multilateralism is fantastic, but as Karen said, it's a process. It's a process of involvement in terms of finding a solution. If you just lump together the 10 top country top 10 emitters of the world, you get more than 2/3 of the total emissions. And that's easier to get these 7 or these 10 around the table to solve a problem than to get the whole world. So in terms of efficiency, I think what is been called plurilateralism, it's probably the way to go. But of course, we need a different president in the United States, because with this one it won't work. Now, with the big question, I mean, James Lovelock, he uses this metaphor of Gaia. He treats the whole planet as a superorganism that is like, I mean, it's a metaphor. I mean, it's in the domain of maybe philosophy even. We could think of a hierarchical life where you have the life of a cell, and the cell, and then it scales up into the organism, and then the organism has a family, and then the family is within a society, and the society is within a micro society, a country, and then you have mega regions or races, if you like, and then you have the world, like humanity, and then you still have life. It was E.O. Wilson, most important biologist alive, that coined this word of biophilia, that we are born with a love for nature and for other life, and this, in a way, it can be seen as this part of a hierarchy of belonging, right? We feel a stronger sense of belonging to the things that are closer to us, but the more distance we are to other things, the bigger our sphere of belonging. I felt that the first time I went to the USA, and it was the first time I felt European, because I thought it was so different. Then suddenly I had in my skin this feeling, well, above all, I'm European. And this was being outside my own microcosm. I realized that my sense of belonging was bigger. So, I mean, but this is, so Gaia, I see it as scaling up all of the principles of ecology, that the science of ecology, and making a metaphor for it. So I don't follow those views on cyborgs. Again, it may be a metaphor, because we are evolving into a digital economy, and we're talking about artificial intelligence, and we're talking about a lot of the jobs being done by machines that are thinking machines. So they can actually do non-trivial jobs, like being a medical doctor, farming. So it's foreseeable that at some point in the future, like when we had the industrial revolution, where lots of activities were done by machines. In the future, this is going to be done by intelligent machines. So in that sense, I can understand where it's going to, but that vision of the cyborgs, it's in the domain today of science fiction. The idea that you can die, but your brain be somehow encapsulated in the machine, so you'll be half alive and half dead. So, I mean, I think it's fun. I like science fiction, but I find it hard to relate to this discussion, because this is clearly within the unknown unknowns. Of course, it's pure imagination. But I mean, there's an issue with Lovelock, and that we all, if we want to, in the days that you wake up and you are more pessimistic, you really can't see the light in the end of the tunnel, because we all are working towards a Green Deal and all kind of things, and trying to fix things. But this is small potatoes. This is trying to get fixes to really, really, really big dynamics that we do not control, and trying to see whether by changing a little things, the whole complex system, which is society, will behave in a different way. And that, I guess, that's one of the big unknowns of the 21st century. Will we be able to avoid a 5 degrees world? And if not, what will we do when London is underwater, New York is underwater, Paris is underwater, and you're losing all of our civilization? Lisbon will be underwater, part of it at least. So, I mean, this, if you can't really get to grip to the big problems we have ahead, the world that our children and grandchildren will have is going to be very, very, very different from the one we have. Now, people adapt. This is not going to be the end of humankind, but it's going to be the end of our civilization as we know it.
Sure, Miguel, very well said. And I think with this, we'll have to close our panel. apologies to at least two questions that we were not able to answer during the time that was apportioned to us. Many thanks to the speakers. You were wonderful, made my role very easy. Thank you very much, and thank to all the many participants who were kind enough to follow our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.